You know that moment when your entire world shifts in a single sentence, when the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the one who destroys you, in front of everyone who matters. That was my Christmas dinner. I'm Allison Torres, 30 years old, successful investor, strategic business consultant. But to my family, I was nothing. Less than nothing. I was their punchline, their scapegoat, the family embarrassment they loved to parade around whenever they needed to feel superior. And on that December night, my father decided to take it further than ever before. Picture this: an elegant dinner table, candlelight, expensive wine. My father standing up with his glass raised, introducing each family member to his boss, the powerful CEO who controlled his entire career. My sister, the corporate rising star. My cousin, freshly engaged. Everyone got their moment of glory. Then he pointed at me. And this... He paused for effect, his smile dripping with contempt. This is the greatest disappointment our family has ever produced. The table erupted. Laughter. Knowing looks. My mother's disgusted smirk, my sister's delighted cackle, like I was the punchline to a joke they'd been telling for 30 years. But his boss. He didn't laugh. He set down his glass, slowly, deliberately. And what happened next didn't just change that dinner, it changed everything. Because what my family didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was that this was just the beginning. The beginning of the truth. The beginning of justice. And the beginning of the most devastating revenge they never saw coming. This is my story. And trust me, you won't believe where it goes. My name is Allison Torres. I'm 30 years old, and for the past 7 years I've built a quiet but successful career as an independent investment consultant specializing in sustainable technology startups. Most people would call that an accomplishment. My family calls it playing with money on a computer, and refuses to acknowledge it as real work. But that night at Christmas dinner, I wasn't thinking about my portfolio or my clients. I was thinking about survival the same way I'd been surviving family gatherings for 3 decades. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine. My mother had outdone herself with the decorations white and gold, everything crystal glasses catching the candlelight, a centerpiece that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The table seated 14 people, all dressed in their holiday finest, all wearing the same practiced smiles that said, "We were a perfect, loving family." It was a beautiful lie, and everyone at that table helped maintain it. Everyone except me. I was the crack in the facade they desperately tried to hide, and tonight they weren't even pretending anymore. I sat near the end of the table, sandwiched between a cousin I barely knew and an empty chair that had been reserved for someone who never showed. Across from me, my younger sister Emily radiated confidence in her designer dress, her engagement ring catching the light every time she gestured. Next to her sat my mother, elegant and cold, as always her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral whenever she looked in my direction. My father held court at the head of the table, and beside him in the place of honor sat his boss, Mr. Anderson, a distinguished man in his late 50s, with silver hair and an unreadable expression. The dinner had started pleasantly enough if you weren't paying attention to the undercurrents. My father dominated the conversation as usual, steering it toward topics that allowed him to showcase the family's successes. He spent 10 minutes describing Emily's recent promotion to senior marketing director, her voice rising with false modesty as she accepted congratulations from around the table. Then came an elaborate discussion of my cousin David's engagement to a lawyer, complete with details about the proposal and speculation about the wedding venue. My aunt beamed. My uncle raised his glass. Everyone applauded. I stayed quiet, cutting my food into smaller and smaller pieces, hoping invisibility might protect me. It never did. "Allison, dear," my mother's voice cut through the chatter, sweet as poisoned honey. "How is your little freelance thing going? Still doing that computer work?" The table's attention swiveled toward me. I could feel 14 pairs of eyes, some curious, most pitying, a few openly amused. This was a trap. It was always a trap. If I downplayed my work, they'd use it as confirmation of my failure. If I explained what I actually did, they'd mock me for being defensive or showing off. "It's going well," I said, simply keeping my voice even. "I'm consulting with several growing companies on strategic investment opportunities." My sister snorted into her wine glass. "Strategic investment opportunities?" She repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's a fancy way of saying you're unemployed, but too proud to admit it." Laughter rippled around the table. Not loud, boisterous laughter, but that knowing, condescending chuckle that said everyone was in on the joke. Everyone except me. "Actually," I started, but my father's voice overrode mine. Now, let's not be too hard on Allison," he said, his tone suggesting the exact opposite. "Not everyone can have a traditional career path. Some people need to find their own way, even if it takes longer. Much longer." More polite laughter. My mother's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. My aunt leaned forward with exaggerated concern. "But Allison, don't you want stability benefits, a retirement plan? What happens when this freelance phase ends and you need to find a real job?" The phrase "real job" landed like a slap. I'd heard it 1,000 times, at family gatherings, in phone calls, in the Christmas cards that arrived with subtle digs buried in cheerful holiday wishes. To them, my work wasn't legitimate. It didn't matter that I'd grown a small investment portfolio into something substantial. It didn't matter that I had clients who valued my analysis. It didn't matter that I earned more than some of them suspected. None of it mattered because it didn't fit their narrow definition of success. "I'm doing fine," I said quietly, knowing anything else would only fuel the fire. "Of course you are, sweetheart," my father said, patting the air in a condescending gesture of appeasement. Then he turned to Anderson with an entirely different expression, eager, ingratiating, desperate to impress. "Robert, I don't think I've properly introduced you to everyone. Let me tell you about this remarkable family of mine." And so it began. My father stood wineglass in hand, like a master of ceremonies preparing to bestow honors. He gestured to Emily first. "This brilliant young woman is my daughter Emily, just promoted to Senior Marketing Director at Hamilton Financial, youngest person in her division to reach that level. We couldn't be prouder." Emily glowed. My mother beamed. The table murmured approval. "And this is my nephew David," he continued, pointing to my cousin. "Recently engaged to a brilliant attorney, Harvard Law. They'll be married next summer in Martha's Vineyard." More approving nods. More congratulations. He went around the table, finding something to praise in each person. Accomplishments, degrees, prestigious jobs, successful marriages. Each introduction was delivered with genuine pride and affection, his voice warm and paternal in a way I recognized because I'd almost never heard it directed at me. Then his hand moved to indicate me. The warmth drained from his voice like water from a broken glass. His expression shifted into something between pity and amusement, the look you might give a stray dog that kept showing up on your porch despite being shooed away repeatedly. "And this," he said, pausing for effect, his timing perfect as always, "this is our family's greatest disappointment." The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the table erupted. Laughter. Genuine, unrestrained laughter. My sister threw her head back, delighted. My mother's lips pursed in what might have been disapproval, but her eyes sparkled with mean satisfaction. Cousins and aunts and uncles joined in, some covering their mouths, as if to pretend they weren't laughing at the cruel joke, others not bothering to hide it at all. I felt my face burn. My hands clenched in my lap beneath the table. 30 years of this. 30 years of being the punchline, the cautionary tale, the example of what not to become. And still, every single time it cut just as deep. But something was different this time. I forced myself to look up to meet the humiliation head-on the way I'd learned to do, and that's when I saw him. Anderson. He wasn't laughing. While everyone else at that table participated in my ritual degradation, Anderson sat perfectly still, his face a careful mask of neutrality. But I'd spent my entire life reading micro-expressions, learning to detect danger in the shift of an eyebrow or the tightening of a jaw. It was a survival skill developed in a household where emotional landmines were everywhere. And I saw it, the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of his wine glass, The way his eyes moved from my father to me and back again, calculating, assessing, seeing something that made the muscles in his neck go taut. He set down his fork, deliberately, precisely. The small clink of silver against china somehow cut through the laughter. The contempt in his expression wasn't directed at me, it was directed at them. Then Anderson put down his glass, and everything shifted. The laughter was still echoing around the dining room when Anderson rose to his feet. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but something about it commanded attention. The chuckling began to fade, replaced by confused glances as people registered that something unexpected was happening. My father, still standing with his wine glass raised, looked momentarily uncertain, as if he'd forgotten his next line in a familiar script. "Robert," my father began, his voice taking on that jovial tone he used when trying to smooth over awkwardness. "I hope you don't think I was being too harsh. It's just family humor, you understand. We can joke with each other because I've been watching this family for 30 years. Anderson interrupted, his voice quiet, but carrying the kind of authority that made the entire room fall silent. And tonight was the last straw. My father's smile froze on his face. Around the table, forks were lowered. Wine glasses stopped halfway to mouths. Even my mother, usually so composed, looked genuinely startled. Anderson's gaze swept across the table, taking in each person with a look that made several of them shift uncomfortably in their seats. When he spoke again, his tone was measured professional, but edged with something cold and final. "I've spent considerable time observing how people treat those they perceive as beneath them," he said. "It tells me everything I need to know about their character. A man who publicly humiliates his own child, who encourages others to join in that cruelty, who finds entertainment in someone else's pain, that man lacks the fundamental character required to lead anyone, in any capacity." My father's face had gone from confident to pale in a matter of seconds. "Now wait just a minute, Robert. This is a family matter. You can't possibly—" "I can, and I will," Anderson said, cutting him off with the kind of finality that made it clear the conversation was not a negotiation. "What I witnessed here tonight isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. The same pattern I've observed in your professional conduct over the past 2 years." The room had gone so quiet, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My sister's face had lost its smug expression. My mother's hand gripped her napkins so tightly her knuckles were white. Anderson turned fully toward my father now, and there was something almost clinical in his assessment. "Corporate headquarters has been building a case regarding your performance for the past 6 months. Dishonesty with clients, taking credit for your team's work, ethical violations that we've documented extensively. We've been watching how you operate, how you treat the people who work under you, how you manipulate situations to benefit yourself at others' expense." My father tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. His face had gone from pale to splotchy red. "What I witnessed here tonight," Anderson continued, "simply confirmed what we already knew. You're unfit for leadership. A man who treats his own daughter with such contempt, who orchestrates public humiliation for his own amusement, cannot be trusted with the responsibility of managing people or representing our company's values." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated," Anderson said, and the simplicity of the statement made it all the more devastating. "You'll receive the formal documentation on Monday. Security will collect your personal items from the office. Your company access has already been revoked." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. My father stood frozen, his wine glass still raised in that ridiculous toast position, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and dawning horror. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Emily's mouth had fallen open. Around the table, relatives stared in various states of shock, some looking at Anderson, some at my father, some at their plates as if desperate to be anywhere else. I sat completely still, my mind unable to process what was happening. Someone had defended me. Not just defended me, but destroyed my tormentor in the process. And he hadn't asked for anything, hadn't needed to be convinced, hadn't made me feel like a burden for requiring protection. He'd simply seen what was happening and acted. It felt surreal, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. My father finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "You can't do this. Robert, please, we can talk about this. I have a mortgage, responsibilities." "You should have considered those responsibilities before you decided to build your self-esteem by destroying someone else's dignity," Anderson said. His tone wasn't angry, it was matter-of-fact, which somehow made it more damning. "I've seen enough." He gathered his coat from the back of his chair with calm efficiency, as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of a family gathering. My father made one more attempt to speak, reaching out a hand in supplication, but Anderson ignored him completely. Instead, he turned to look directly at me. The expression on his face changed entirely. Where he'd looked at my father with cold professional distance and at the rest of the family with barely concealed disgust, he looked at me with something else entirely. Recognition, respect, and something that looked almost like protectiveness. Our eyes met across the table, and in that moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. Not as a disappointment or a failure or a punchline, but as a person, someone who mattered, someone who deserved better than what she'd been given. He walked around the table, his footsteps the only sound in the silent room, and stopped beside my chair. Then he leaned toward me and said in a voice low enough that only I could hear, "We need to talk. Privately." I followed Anderson through the dining room in a daze, aware of the stunned faces tracking our movement, but unable to process any of it. Behind us, chaos was beginning to erupt. My mother's voice rose in sharp accusation, my father's in desperate pleading, but Anderson moved through it all as if walking through a storm that couldn't touch him. He held the back door open for me, and I stepped out into the December cold, the shock of it helping to clear some of the fog from my mind. The backyard was quiet, insulated from the disaster inside by thick walls and double-paned windows. String lights my mother had hung for aesthetic purposes cast a soft glow across the patio furniture. Anderson gestured to a bench beneath the pergola, and I sat my legs, grateful for the support. He remained standing for a moment, looking out at the winter garden, and I noticed for the first time how tired he seemed, not physically exhausted, but carrying the weight of something heavy and long held. "Your grandfather was my closest friend," he said, finally turning to face me. "For 23 years we were business partners, confidants, and brothers in every way that mattered. His name was Richard Torres, though I suspect you barely remember him." The name sparked a fragment of memory. Warm hands, a deep laugh, the smell of pipe tobacco and peppermint. "He died when I was 7, I said softly. "I remember him being kind. That's about all." "He was kind," Anderson agreed, and something in his expression softened. "Especially to you. He adored you, Allison. In those last few years of his life, you were one of the only things that brought him genuine joy. But you were also his greatest source of worry." He sat down beside me then, and I noticed he was carrying a leather portfolio I hadn't seen him pick up. He held it in his lap, his fingers tracing the edge as if steadying himself. "When you were 5 years old, Richard came to me with a request," Anderson continued. "He'd witnessed something that disturbed him deeply. Your mother had struck you during a family gathering, not hard enough to leave visible marks, but hard enough to make you cry. When Richard confronted her, she laughed it off as discipline, but he saw something in her eyes that day, something cold and resentful. He realized his daughter didn't love you. She resented your very existence. The words should have shocked me, but they didn't. They explained too much, clarified too many memories I'd tried to rationalize away. He asked me to make him a promise," Anderson said, "to watch over you from a distance, to keep certain legal documents safe, and to intervene when you turned 30 years old, not a day before. He was very specific about the timing. He believed you needed to be old enough to handle what was coming, strong enough to fight the battle he knew would follow." 30 years, I whispered, doing the math. "You've been watching me for 30 years. Observing," he corrected gently. "Through various channels, school records when you were young, community connections, professional networks as you got older. I never interfered, never made contact." Those were his explicit instructions, but I kept track. I knew when you graduated high school despite your family refusing to attend the ceremony. I knew when you started your investment consulting work. And 3 years ago, I discovered something remarkable. He smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him all evening. You published an article analyzing emerging markets in sustainable technology under the pseudonym A.R. Torres. It was brilliant, insightful data driven ahead of the curve in ways that impressed even seasoned analysts. That's when I knew Richard's faith in you was justified. You hadn't just survived your family's cruelty, you'd become extraordinary despite it. My mind reeled. But my father, you hired him 2 years ago. That wasn't... No, it wasn't coincidence, Anderson admitted. When your father applied to our company, I saw it as providence. An opportunity to observe the family dynamics firsthand, to confirm what I suspected about how they treated you. I needed to understand the full scope of what you were dealing with before I could act. Your father's actual job performance was adequate at first, but over time his true character revealed itself. The dishonesty, the credit stealing, the casual cruelty towards subordinates. Everything I saw at work mirrored what Richard had warned me about. He paused, his expression growing serious. Your 30th birthday was 3 weeks ago. Tonight was the first opportunity I had to observe you and your family together in a social setting. I needed to see it for myself before moving forward, and what I witnessed exceeded my worst expectations. The way they treated you, the systematic humiliation, the casual cruelty treated as entertainment. Anderson lifted the leather portfolio and held it out to me. This is yours. It's always been yours. My hands trembled as I took it. The leather was soft, expensive, well-maintained. I opened it slowly and found myself looking at documents I couldn't fully process. Legal papers with official seals, a business proposal with my name listed as a principal partner, and on top of everything, a sealed envelope in handwriting I almost recognized yellowed with age. The letter is from your grandfather, Anderson said quietly. He wrote it 25 years ago, shortly before he died. The business proposal is from me, an opportunity I've been holding for you. And the legal documents are references to your grandfather's real will, not the one your mother presented to probate, the real one. I looked up sharply. What? Richard never trusted your mother, Anderson said. He saw how she treated you, understood what she was capable of, and made very specific provisions to protect your inheritance. But he knew if he left everything to a child, your mother would find ways to control it, to steal it, to use it against you. So he set up a trust that couldn't be accessed until you turned 30, until you were old enough to fight for it, old enough to handle the war that will come when the truth is revealed. He gestured to the portfolio in my hands. Everything you need to know is in there, but the most important thing you need to understand right now is this: you are not who they told you that you are. You never were. I stared down at the folder at my name typed in bold letters across the top of the partnership proposal and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Inside the folder was a contract with my name typed in bold. I sat on that cold bench staring at the documents in my lap, Anderson's words echoing in my mind, and something occurred to me that I hadn't expected to feel in this moment. Guilt. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd been keeping secrets too. Secrets that suddenly felt relevant to this conversation about trust and hidden truths. There's something you should know, I said quietly, looking up at Anderson. About me. About what I've actually been doing these past 7 years. He tilted his head, curious, but not surprised, as if he'd been expecting this. My family thinks I'm barely scraping by. I continued, choosing my words carefully. They think my freelance work is code for unemployment, that I'm 1 bad month away from moving back home and begging for help. They believe that because I've let them believe it, because it's safer that way. I took a breath, steadying myself. 7 years ago, I took $3,000 I'd saved from legitimate freelance consulting work and invested it in a small green technology startup that nobody had heard of. A company developing more efficient solar panel technology. I'd done months of research, analyzed market trends, studied the team's credentials. Everyone I mentioned it to said I was throwing money away on a fantasy. Anderson's expression shifted to something approaching interest. Let me guess, the fantasy paid off. Beyond anything I'd imagined, I admitted. That first investment returned 8 times what I put in within 2 years. I reinvested the profits, diversified into sustainable agriculture technology, electric vehicle infrastructure, water purification systems. I taught myself everything I could about emerging markets, environmental technology, regulatory changes that would impact green industries. I spent hours every night reading research papers, financial reports, patent filings. The words came faster now, years of forced silence breaking open. I became a silent partner in 4 different startups. Not as an employee, not as a consultant they could dismiss, but as an actual investor with equity stakes. I use encrypted email virtual private networks and a business manager who handles the public-facing communications, so my name never appears in searchable databases. My portfolio is worth just over $800,000 right now. By next year, based on current projections, it should break $1 million. Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. That's remarkable, especially for someone working without formal training or institutional support. I had to do it this way, I said, and now the guilt transformed into something harder, more defensive. I had to hide it because every single time I succeeded at anything, they destroyed it. When I was 12, I won a regional writing competition. The prize was a scholarship to a summer writing camp and an awards ceremony where my work would be published in an anthology. I was so excited I could barely sleep. I told my mother the morning the acceptance letter arrived. The memory still stung after 18 years. She threw it away while I was at school, told me later that I needed to focus on practical skills instead of wasting time on childish hobbies. I missed the registration deadline. I never got to go to that camp or see my work published. Anderson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting me continue. When I was 16, I earned a partial academic scholarship to a decent university. Not Ivy League, but respectable. It would have covered half my tuition. The financial aid office called our house to confirm my acceptance. My father answered. He told them I wasn't interested in attending and hung up, never mentioned it to me. I only found out 2 years later when I was applying to community college and saw the notation in my record scholarship declined by parent. My hands clenched around the portfolio. When I was 22, I'd saved almost $4,000 from working 2 jobs while going to school part-time. I was going to use it for a professional certification that would have helped me get better consulting clients. My sister asked to borrow $500 for what she said was an emergency. I gave it to her because that's what family does, right? She never paid it back. When I asked about it a month later, she acted offended that I'd even mentioned it. Eventually, she admitted she'd used it for a shopping trip and didn't see why it mattered because we're family and family shares. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. After that, I learned. Success made me a target. Achievement meant they'd find ways to take it, diminish it, or use it against me. So I disappeared. I let them think I was failing while I quietly built something real, something they couldn't touch because they didn't know it existed. Anderson nodded, slowly, understanding written across his face. Survival through invisibility. Exactly, I said. But this proposal you're offering me, this partnership in commercial real estate restructuring with full operational authority and equity stakes, this would take everything I've built from the shadows into the light. You're talking about regional expansion to national scale, public business registration, my name on contracts and company documents, press releases when projects succeed. I looked down at the partnership agreement again at the scope of what he was proposing. Leadership of a major commercial renovation project, decision-making authority over millions in capital, the chance to prove my strategic abilities on a platform that mattered. If I accept this, I said quietly, there's no hiding anymore. My family will find out. Not just about this opportunity, but probably about everything I've built. They'll dig, they'll investigate. And when they discover I've been quietly successful while letting them mock me as a failure, their reaction won't be pride or happiness. It'll be rage. They'll feel entitled to it, to me, to everything I've earned. Yes, Anderson said simply. They will. And you're offering this to me anyway. I'm offering it because you've earned it, he corrected. Because your strategic analysis is sound, your instincts are excellent, and your ability to identify emerging opportunities before they become obvious is exactly what this project needs. Your family's potential reaction is their problem, not yours. The question is whether you're ready to stop hiding your success to protect people who've never protected you. I stared at the contract at my name in bold at the opportunity to finally step into the person I'd been building in secret for 7 years. The risk was real. The consequences would be brutal. But so was the alternative, continuing to hide, to minimize myself, to play small in a life that should have been big. Success rarely goes unnoticed, especially in my family. I left Anderson's proposal on my kitchen counter that night, the leather portfolio sitting there like a promise and a threat all at once. I didn't sleep. Instead, I paced my small apartment, weighing the decision that would change everything. By morning, I still hadn't decided whether to sign the contract, but the decision was made for me in a different way entirely. My phone started ringing at 7:30 with a number I recognized immediately, my mother's landline. I didn't answer. 3 more calls followed in the next hour, then text messages from my sister, my aunt, even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. The family machine had activated, and I was the target. By noon, I'd learned through a forwarded email from that same distant cousin that my parents had called an emergency family meeting the night before. I wasn't invited naturally, but the cousin thought I should know what was being said about me. According to her second-hand account, my mother had stood in her living room and declared me cursed, bad luck, a dark cloud that brought misfortune to everyone around me. My father, humiliated and unemployed, had been only too happy to agree. The firing was my fault somehow. My presence at the dinner had jinxed everything. If I hadn't been there, if they hadn't been forced to acknowledge me, none of this would have happened. It was the same scapegoating I'd endured my entire life, the familiar pattern of blame that required no logic, only a target. But my cousin's email also mentioned something else, a detail that made my stomach tighten with awareness. During the meeting, my aunt had apparently asked a question that hung in the air, unanswered. Why did Anderson treat Allison with such respect? Why did he look at her like that? According to my cousin, the room had gone quiet. Because it was true, and they'd all noticed it. Anderson had looked at me like I mattered, like I was someone worth defending, and that simply didn't fit the narrative they'd spent 30 years constructing. The confusion was a crack in their certainty, and cracks let in light. Over the next few days, I noticed the shift. It started small. My sister showed up at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked on my laptop, claiming she just happened to be in the neighborhood. She sat down across from me without invitation, her eyes scanning my appearance with an attention she'd never bothered with before. I watched her gaze linger on my sweater, a soft cashmere blend I'd bought on clearance from a high-end retailer's online sale. $300 marked down to $70, but still recognizably quality. Her eyes moved to my leather laptop bag, simple but well-made, then to my phone sitting face down on the table. The newest model purchased outright, because I hated payment plans and had the cash available. "That's a nice sweater," she said, her tone falsely casual. "Where'd you get it?" "Online," I answered, not looking up from my screen. "Must have been expensive." "It was on sale." She didn't leave. She ordered coffee. She didn't drink and made small talk. I didn't engage with her presence, a clear surveillance mission disguised as sisterly interest. When her questions about my work became too pointed, I closed my laptop, made an excuse about a client call, and left. I could feel her watching me walk away, could practically hear the mental calculations happening behind her narrowed eyes. The phone call started after that. My mother, suddenly warm and concerned, asking how I was doing financially, whether I needed help with anything. Had I been eating well? The false sweetness in her voice was so thick it was almost parody, but underneath it ran a current of something else. Confusion. Uncertainty. She'd never asked about my well-being before because she'd never cared, but now she needed information and was willing to pretend motherly concern to get it. I gave her nothing. Polite responses, surface-level pleasantries. When she pushed about my work, I said it was going fine. When she asked about my living situation, I said I was managing. Every non-answer made her more frustrated, and I could hear it in the tightness of her voice by the time we said goodbye. My aunt called next, then a cousin, then my sister again. Each conversation followed the same pattern, false warmth masking information-gathering questions, designed to sound casual, but aimed at extracting specifics about my income, my clients, my daily activities. They were building a picture, trying to reconcile the struggling failure they'd created in their minds with the evidence accumulating before their eyes. I never asked for money anymore. I hadn't in years, actually, but they were only noticing now. My rent was always paid on time. My car, while old, was well-maintained and reliable. I dressed simply, but when they looked closer, nothing I owned was cheap or worn. The observations didn't fit, and it was driving them crazy. I learned from my cousins' continued updates that the family discussions had evolved. No longer content to simply blame me for my father's firing, they were now speculating about what I might be hiding. My mother had apparently gone through old photos and noticed that in recent years, I looked healthier, more put together, less stressed, despite supposedly barely surviving financially. My sister had mentioned the private phone calls she'd witnessed during family gatherings, the way I always stepped away to take them the professional tone I used. Someone had noticed I'd mentioned clients multiple times over the years without ever explaining what kind of clients or what I did for them. The narrative was crumbling and they couldn't stand not knowing what lay beneath it. So they decided they had a right to know. My mother declared in another family meeting that I was being secretive and suspicious, that families shouldn't have secrets from each other, that they deserved to understand what was really going on in my life. The irony was suffocating. These were the same people who'd hidden things from me my entire life, who'd made decisions about my future without consulting me, who'd built a wall between me and any real family connection. But now suddenly they needed transparency. Their real motivation wasn't love or concern. It was jealousy wrapped in entitlement control, masquerading as care, and underneath it all, the growing fear that they'd been fundamentally wrong about me. That possibility terrified them more than anything else, because if they'd been wrong about me, then every cruel word, every dismissal, every public humiliation became something they'd have to answer for. They couldn't let that stand. So they started investigating in earnest, convinced that they had every right to uncover whatever I was hiding. They didn't see it as violation. They saw it as family prerogative. And my sister was the first to strike. She showed up on a Saturday morning with 2 expensive lattes and a smile so forced it looked painful. I opened my apartment door to find Emily standing there in designer athleisure, her hair perfectly styled, despite the early hour, holding the coffee cups like peace offerings. "Allison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, "I've been so worried about you. Can we talk?" Every instinct I'd honed over 3 decades screamed danger, but I stepped aside and let her in anyway. Partly because refusing would have created drama I didn't need, partly because I was curious about what approach she'd take. I'd seen Emily manipulate boyfriends, coworkers, even our parents when it suited her purposes. I'd watched her deploy tears charm and calculated vulnerability with the precision of a surgeon. This was going to be a performance, and I wanted to see how she'd play it. She settled onto my couch as if she belonged there, setting the lattes on my coffee table and looking around my apartment with poorly concealed assessment. Her eyes cataloged everything the bookshelf with my collection of investment and market analysis, texts, the minimal but quality furniture, the laptop sitting closed on my desk, the lack of clutter that came from living lean and organized. "I love what you've done with the place," she said, though her tone suggested she found it disappointingly modest. "It's very you. Understated." The backhanded compliment landed exactly as intended, but I'd stopped letting her barbs draw blood years ago. I sat in the chair across from her, deliberately not touching the coffee she'd brought, and waited. "I wanted to apologize," Emily began, and I almost laughed at the audacity. "For the dinner, for laughing. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realized that wasn't fair to you." "Fair," I repeated, tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice of words." "Well, you know how Dad can be," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "He gets carried away sometimes. But I should have stood up for you. I should have said something." She'd never stood up for me in 30 years. Not once. Not when we were children and I was being punished for things I didn't do. Not in adolescence, when our mother's favoritism was so blatant it was painful. Not in adulthood, when family gatherings became stages for my ritual humiliation. But now suddenly, she'd discovered a conscience. "Why are you really here, Emily?" I asked directly. She blinked, thrown by my refusal to play along. "I told you. I wanted to apologize and check on you, see how you're doing." "I'm fine." "Are you, though?" She leaned forward, her expression shifting to concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Because I've been thinking about that night, about Anderson. The way he defended you was so intense, so personal, and the things he said about watching our family for 30 years. What was that about?" There it was, the real reason for the visit. "You'd have to ask him," I said evenly. "But he must have said something to you afterward. I saw you two leave together." Her questions were coming faster now, the pretense of casual conversation slipping. "Did he explain why he reacted that way? Do you know him somehow? Have you been meeting with him?" "Why would I have been meeting with him?" "I don't know, that's what I'm asking." Frustration was creeping into her voice. "It's just strange, Allison. All of it. How are you even affording this apartment? How's your work really going? You never talk about specifics. What kind of clients do you have? How much are you actually making?" The mask was falling away completely now, revealing the calculation underneath. She wasn't here to apologize or reconcile. She was here to extract information, to build a picture of my life that made sense within her framework of me as the family failure. "My finances are my business," I said calmly. "Families shouldn't have secrets from each other." She shot back, and the irony was so thick I couldn't let it pass. "Really? Like the secret that you spent the money I lent you on a shopping trip instead of the emergency you claimed, or the secret that Mom threw away my writing competition acceptance, or the secret that Dad declined my scholarship without telling me, those kinds of family secrets." Her face flushed. "That's different. That was years ago, and you're being dramatic about it anyway. We're trying to look out for you now." "No," I said, standing up. "You're trying to figure out what I'm hiding because Anderson's reaction made you question whether you've been wrong about me. And the possibility that you've been wrong terrifies you because it means you've been cruel to someone who didn't deserve it." Emily stood too, her face hardening into something more familiar. The sister I knew, the one without pretense. "Keeping secrets is hurtful, Allison. It damages family trust. We have a right to know what's going on in your life." "You have a right to exactly what I choose to share," I corrected. "Which is nothing." She grabbed her purse, the fake concern evaporating entirely. "Fine, be stubborn. But you should know that no matter how much you try to hide things, family always finds out. We always know more than you think we do." The threat was clear, and I recognized it for what it was. She headed for the door, then paused. "Can I use your bathroom before I go?" I nodded, watching as she disappeared down the hall. She was in there for 7 minutes. I timed it standing in my living room, listening to the water run far longer than necessary for hand washing. When she emerged, her expression was neutral, her purse slightly more full than when she'd entered. "Thanks for the talk," she said and left. I waited until I heard her car pull away before I started my inspection. The bathroom revealed nothing obvious, but I hadn't expected it to. I moved to my bedroom, my office checking drawers and surfaces. In my desk, the drawer where I kept less important papers was slightly ajar. I always closed it completely. Always. The folder Anderson had given me was locked in my safe, thank God, but other documents had been disturbed. Bank statements from 2 months ago, a printout of a client contract, nothing catastrophic, but enough to give her pieces of a puzzle. That night, something went missing from my home. I discovered the theft at 2 a.m. when I couldn't sleep and went to check on Anderson's portfolio one more time. The leather folder wasn't where I'd left it in my locked desk drawer. My hands went cold as I pulled the drawer completely out, checking behind it underneath it, knowing even as I searched that it was pointless. The lock hadn't been forced. Someone had picked it, and I knew exactly who and when. Emily's 7-minute bathroom visit, the slight bulge in her purse when she left, the drawer that had been ajar. She hadn't just been snooping through loose papers. She'd been systematically searching my apartment, and she'd found what she was looking for. The portfolio contained everything: the partnership contract with my name and the project details, Anderson's letter explaining our connection. Most damaging of all, the references to my grandfather's real will and the inheritance I was supposedly entitled to. She had documentation of opportunities, I'd hidden wealth I'd never mentioned, and legal claims that positioned me as far more than the struggling freelancer they believed me to be. I sat on my bedroom floor, my back against the bed, and felt a strange calm settle over me. The violation should have made me angry, and part of me was, but mostly I felt a tired recognition. Of course she'd stolen from me. Of course she'd invaded my privacy without remorse. This was who they were. This was who they'd always been. The only surprise was that I'd let my guard down enough to make it possible. I spent the rest of that night backing up every digital file I had, changing passwords, and moving my most important documents to a safety deposit box I opened first thing Monday morning. If Emily had taken the physical portfolio I needed to ensure she couldn't access anything else. Anderson had mentioned sending encrypted backups to my email. I verified they were there, downloaded them to an external drive, and locked that away too. The call started Tuesday afternoon. My phone lit up with my mother's number, then my father's, then Emily's, then numbers I didn't recognize that I assumed belonged to various aunts and uncles who'd been pulled into whatever narrative was being constructed. I let them all go to voicemail. By Wednesday morning, I had 17 unread text messages and 9 voicemails. I made myself coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started reading. The messages from Emily came first, sent at midnight the night after her visit. Long paragraphs about family loyalty and sharing blessings, about how she'd always supported me and deserved honesty in return. She wrote about how hurt she was to discover I'd been hiding such significant opportunities, how betrayed she felt that I hadn't trusted the family with this information. The subtext was clear. She'd read everything in that portfolio, and she was already spinning the narrative to position herself as the wronged party. My mother's texts were shorter, but more aggressive. "We need to talk immediately. Call me now. This is unacceptable behavior from a daughter." Each message vibrated with barely contained fury that I'd dared to have a life they didn't control, resources they didn't know about, opportunities they hadn't approved. My father's voicemails were a schizophrenic mix of rage and desperation. In one, he shouted about disrespect and secrecy, his voice thick with the entitlement of a man who'd just lost his job and discovered his disappointing daughter might have access to money. In another, left just an hour later, his tone shifted to wounded confusion, asking why I hadn't told him about my grandfather's estate, wondering if we could talk about this like adults. But it was the group text that revealed the full scope of what I was facing. Someone, probably my mother, had created a family group chat that included everyone except me. My cousin forwarded me screenshots. The conversation was a masterclass in entitlement and twisted logic. They'd convinced themselves that anything connected to my grandfather's estate was family money. Not my inheritance, not my opportunity. Family money that I'd been selfishly hoarding while letting them believe I was struggling. The grandfather who'd left everything to me, specifically who'd written a letter warning me about his daughter, who'd trusted Anderson to protect me from exactly this kind of claim, none of that mattered to them. In their narrative, I was the thief. I'd stolen from the family by accepting an inheritance meant for all of us. My silence about it was evidence of my greed and betrayal. I watched the pattern unfold in real time, the same pattern I'd seen play out in smaller ways throughout my childhood. Discovery led to reinterpretation. My success became their entitlement. My privacy became my crime. Facts bent themselves into whatever shape justified their feelings. And those feelings were already crystallizing into demands I could see forming in the increasingly aggressive messages. They wanted a family meeting. They wanted explanations. They wanted, though they hadn't said it directly yet, a share of whatever I had. Because that's what family did. Family shared. Family supported each other. All the obligations they'd never extended to me were suddenly sacred principles I was violating by keeping what was mine. I had resources now. Anderson's backing, legal documentation of my grandfather's intentions, proof that the inheritance was specifically structured to protect it from exactly this kind of family interference. I had allies' leverage and the financial means to fight whatever battle they were preparing to wage. But I also knew what fighting would cost. The emotional toll of going to war with your own family, even a toxic one, the public drama, the smear campaign they'd undoubtedly launch, the way they'd position themselves as the victims of my cruelty, my selfishness, my abandonment of family values. I could surrender, give them something to keep the peace, let them believe I was still the weak, desperate daughter who'd do anything to avoid conflict. Or I could stand firm and accept that the war was coming whether I wanted it or not. The next morning, Father called me sounding unusually gentle. I answered on the third ring, already braced for whatever was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the voice on the other end. Sweetheart. My father said the word so foreign in his mouth it took me a moment to register he was talking to me. In 30 years he'd never called me that. Never used any term of endearment, actually. I was Allison when he bothered to address me directly, or your daughter when speaking about me to others, always with that slight emphasis that made it clear he found the relationship burdensome. Dad, I said, carefully waiting. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that dinner. He continued, his voice soft, almost breaking. About what happened, about the things I said. And I want you to know that I'm sorry, sweetheart. I was too harsh. I let the stress of work get to me, and I took it out on you in a way that was completely unfair. The apology was smooth, well-rehearsed, hitting every note of paternal remorse. He paused in the right places, let his voice catch with what sounded like genuine emotion. If I hadn't spent 3 decades learning to detect manipulation, I might have believed it. Losing my job has given me time to reflect, he went on. Time to think about my failures as a father, about the ways I've let you down over the years. I see that now. I see how I've been too critical, too dismissive of your accomplishments. I want to do better. I want us to have a real relationship. I stayed silent, letting him fill the space with his performance. The truth is, he said, and now his voice dropped to something more intimate, more vulnerable. I've been proud of you all along. I just didn't know how to show it. I was raised by a father who never showed emotion, never praised his children, and I repeated those patterns without thinking. But I'm older now, wiser, and I don't want to waste whatever time we have left holding on to these old resentments. It was masterful, really. The acknowledgement of fault without accepting real responsibility. The claim of hidden pride that conveniently explained away decades of cruelty. The appeal to mortality and family bonds. Every word calculated to bypass my defenses and trigger that desperate child inside who'd always wanted her father's approval. I appreciate the apology, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I'm glad, he said, relief flooding his voice. Then came the pivot so smooth I almost missed it. And I hope you'll understand that this is a difficult time for all of us. Your mother and I are facing some serious financial challenges with me being out of work. The mortgage payment is substantial. Your mother's medications aren't cheap. And your sister is still paying off her student loans, you know. There it was, the real reason for the call. We're family, he continued, his voice taking on a gentle firmness. And family takes care of each other in times of need. Children have a duty to support their parents, especially when those parents have given them everything. It's not about money, sweetheart. It's about showing that we matter to each other. He didn't mention the stolen portfolio, didn't acknowledge that he knew about my partnership opportunity or the inheritance references Emily had found, but the implication hung in the air between us, heavy and unmistakable. He knew I had resources. He knew I'd been hiding them. And now he expected me to contribute to the family's financial rescue. I understand you're going through a difficult time, I said slowly, but I can't provide financial support right now. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds where I could practically hear him recalculating, reassessing, deciding which mask to wear next. When he spoke again, the gentle father had vanished entirely. Can't or won't? His voice was cold now, sharp with accusation. After everything we've done for you, we fed you clothed, you put a roof over your head for 18 years. We gave you opportunities, we invested in you, and this is how you repay us by abandoning your family when we need you most. You're asking me for money I don't lie to me, Allison." The words came fast now, angry, all pretense stripped away. "We know about the partnership. We know about the inheritance. We know you've been sitting on opportunities and resources while letting your family believe you were barely surviving. That's not just selfish, it's cruel. It's a betrayal of everything family means." My hands tightened around the phone. That partnership is an opportunity I earned. The inheritance, if there even is one, was left specifically to me by my grandfather. Neither of those things are family money. "Everything connected to this family is family money," he shot back. "Your grandfather was my father-in-law. That estate has Torres family assets in it, assets that should benefit all of us, not just you. You have a moral obligation to share. That's what decent people do." "I'm not giving you money, Dad." "You're making a mistake," he said, and now his voice carried a threat barely veiled by a thin layer of concern. "A serious mistake. Family doesn't forget betrayals like this, Allison. There are consequences to turning your back on the people who raised you. You'll regret this decision, I promise you that." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," he corrected his tone, suggesting he was doing me a favor by even bothering. "From a father who still cares about his daughter despite her selfishness. But if you want to be stubborn, if you want to choose money over family, then you'll have to live with those choices. Just don't come crying to us when you realize what you've lost." The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen phone, still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence and feeling that familiar exhaustion that came from family interactions. The performance had lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish. Apology to demand to threat, all executed with the efficiency of someone who'd done this dance many times before with different partners. I set my phone on the counter and took a breath, steadying myself. The war I'd anticipated was here. Not coming, but here already in motion, and I'd just fired the opening shot by refusing to be the ATM they'd decided I should be. And as soon as I hung up, someone was waiting outside my door. The knock came before I'd even set my phone down. 3 firm raps, professional and unhurried. I looked through the peephole and saw Anderson standing in my hallway, still in his business suit, despite it being nearly 8 in the evening. He looked tired but calm, and somehow unsurprised to find himself at my door. I opened it, questions already forming, but he spoke first. "May I come in? I suspect you've had a difficult conversation, and we should talk." I stepped aside, letting him enter. He moved to my small living room and waited until I sat before taking the chair across from me, the same professional courtesy I'd noticed at the Christmas dinner. Even in crisis, his manners were impeccable. "Your sister took the portfolio," he said, not a question but a statement. "How did you know?" "Because I've seen this pattern before," he replied. "I anticipated it the moment I gave you those documents." Toxic family members follow predictable trajectories. First, they dismiss you as worthless. Then circumstances force them to see your actual value. That revelation transforms their contempt into entitlement. They convince themselves they deserve whatever you have, and they move quickly to claim it before you can protect it. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then showed it to me. "This is why I sent encrypted backups to your secure email the same night of the dinner. The physical portfolio your sister stole contains copies, not originals. The actual partnership contracts, the legal documents about your grandfather's estate. All of it is safely stored in multiple secure locations. What she took is evidence of her theft, not leverage against you." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by something else. Gratitude, but also a kind of wonder that someone had thought this far ahead on my behalf. "You knew she'd steal from me." "I knew someone would," Anderson said. "The question was whether it would be your sister, your mother, or both of them working together. Your sister was faster, which suggests she's either more desperate or more ambitious than I gave her credit for." He set his phone aside and looked at me directly, his expression shifting from professional to something more personal. "I told you, I'd been watching your family for 30 years. What I didn't tell you is why I recognized the pattern so quickly, why I knew exactly what would happen once they realized you had value they could exploit. I waited, sensing he was about to share something he rarely discussed. "My mother was remarkably similar to yours," he said quietly. "Controlling, emotionally abusive expert at wielding guilt as a weapon. I was the scapegoat child in my family. My younger brother was the golden child who could do no wrong. Every achievement I earned was minimized or attributed to luck. Every mistake my brother made was excused or blamed on circumstances beyond his control." His voice remained steady, but I could hear the old pain underneath it. "When I started my business, and it began to succeed, my mother reappeared in my life after 3 years of minimal contact. She'd moved across the country to be closer to my brother, had made it clear I was an embarrassment to her. But suddenly, with money on the table, I became her beloved son again. She showed up at my office claiming I owed her, that she'd sacrificed everything to raise me, that supporting her in her old age was my moral obligation." "What did you do?" I asked. "I gave her money the first time," Anderson admitted. "Enough to cover what she claimed were urgent medical expenses. Within 2 months, she was back asking for more, to help my brother with his business, to cover the costs of a house she wanted to buy. The demands escalated until I realized they would never stop. She didn't see me as a son. She saw me as a resource to be extracted until there was nothing left." He met my eyes. "I had to legally disengage from my entire family, restraining orders, cease and desist letters through attorneys. It was brutal and public and necessary, and I learned something valuable from that experience. You cannot negotiate with people who fundamentally believe they're entitled to you. Compromise is interpreted as weakness. Generosity is seen as confirmation that they deserve more. The only solution is complete separation." The parallel to my own situation was painfully clear. "You're saying I need to cut them off entirely." "I'm saying they've already declared war," Anderson corrected. "The question is whether you're prepared to fight it, whether you're ready to accept that the family you wish you had isn't the family you actually have." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and brass, an old-fashioned key worn smooth at the edges, heavy in a way that suggested quality and age. "This is the key to the building I mentioned in the partnership proposal," he said, holding it out to me. "It's a commercial property in a neighborhood that's currently revitalizing. The building has good bones, but it's been mismanaged for years. High vacancy rate, deferred maintenance, reputation for unreliable management. Most investors see it as a problem property. I see it as an opportunity for someone with strategic vision and genuine care for community impact." I took the key, feeling the weight of it in my palm. "If you accept this partnership, you'll have full operational authority," Anderson continued. "You'll make the decisions about tenant selection, renovation priorities, community programming, financial structure. I'll provide the capital and the corporate backing, but the vision and execution will be yours. It's not charity, Allison. It's a meritocratic opportunity based on your demonstrated analytical abilities and strategic thinking." "And the equity stake?" I asked. 20% ownership to start, with the option to increase to 40% based on performance benchmarks," he said. "You'll draw a competitive salary plus profit sharing. Everything documented legally and transparently. This is a real business partnership between equals, not a favor from a family friend." I looked down at the key, at this tangible piece of my potential future, and felt something shift in my chest. My family wanted to trap me in their narrative of my worthlessness, to force me back into the role of desperate supplicant who owed them everything. This key represented the opposite. It was proof that someone saw my actual capabilities and was willing to invest in them, not because we shared blood, but because I'd earned it. "There's one thing you should understand," Anderson added. "If you accept this opportunity, your family will find out. The business will be registered publicly. Tenants will know your name. Success, if it comes, will be visible. You won't be able to hide anymore." "I know," I said. "They'll escalate," he warned. "They'll make demands. They'll threaten legal action. They'll try to destroy your reputation. They'll do everything in their power to punish you for choosing yourself over their exploitation." "I know," I repeated. He nodded slowly, something like approval in his expression. "Then the only question left is whether you're ready." I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its solid weight, its promise. This key didn't just unlock a building, it unlocked a new life. I stood in front of the building the next morning with the brass key in my hand and felt something I hadn't experienced in years possibility without fear attached to it. The structure was 5 stories of weathered brick built sometime in the 1920s, judging by the architectural details, with large windows that had been covered over with plywood and a ground floor that showed evidence of multiple failed retail attempts. The neighborhood around it was in transition, old warehouses being converted to lofts, new restaurants appearing alongside longtime family businesses, the kind of area that was 1 or 2 years away from being declared the next hot neighborhood. I let myself in through the heavy front door and spent the first 3 hours just walking, observing, taking notes. The vacancy rate was worse than Anderson had mentioned, nearly 60% empty, with only a handful of long-term tenants who seemed to be paying below market rates out of loyalty or pity. The common areas were dim and unwelcoming. The lighting was all wrong, fluorescent and harsh where it existed at all. Deferred maintenance was evident everywhere I looked. Cracked floor tiles, water stains on ceilings, outdated electrical systems that would need serious upgrading. But underneath the neglect, I could see what this building had been and could be again. High ceilings with original architectural details, hardwood floors beneath cheap carpeting, natural light flooding through those large windows once the plywood came down. The building had good bones, as my grandfather would have said, though I was too young to remember if he'd actually ever said that or if I was inventing the memory. I spent the next 2 weeks conducting systematic analysis. Demographics of the neighborhood median age, skewing older median income, moderate but stable high percentage of longtime residents mixed with younger newcomers. Foot traffic patterns showing morning and evening peaks. Competitor analysis revealing a shortage of community-oriented gathering spaces and locally owned retail. The previous management strategy became clear through old leasing documents they'd been chasing corporate tenants who wanted modern, generic spaces. But this building's strength wasn't modern. It was historic character in a neighborhood that valued authenticity. My proposal when I presented it to Anderson was comprehensive. Convert the ground floor to community-serving retail, a bookstore cafe that could host events, a space for local artisans, a wellness center. The upper floors would house small professional offices and a dedicated community room available for classes, meetings, social gatherings. The target demographic wasn't young tech workers or corporate offices. It was the neighborhood itself, particularly older women who were chronically underserved when it came to third spaces that weren't bars or expensive restaurants. Anderson read through my 50-page strategic plan and smiled. "Your grandfather would have loved this." "Did he think this way?" I asked. "About community impact." "Always," Anderson said. "He believed buildings should serve the people who lived around them, not the other way around. That philosophy made him less wealthy than he could have been, but more respected than any developer I've ever known." He approved the plan and the budget, and I got to work. The renovations took 6 weeks. I hired local contractors, where possible prioritizing quality over speed. We stripped away the cheap updates to reveal original features, upgraded systems to modern efficiency standards, while maintaining period details and reconfigured spaces to maximize natural light and accessibility. I interviewed potential tenants personally, looking for businesses that aligned with the community vision rather than whoever could pay the highest rent. It was during the 3rd week of renovations that I found it. I'd been reviewing the 3rd floor layout, comparing the actual measurements to the building plans when I noticed a discrepancy. The hallway was 8 feet shorter than the exterior walls suggested it should be. Behind a door marked electrical that I'd assumed was a utility closet, I found a room. It was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with one large window that had been covered from the outside. Someone had maintained this space deliberately, keeping it clean and preserved even while the rest of the building deteriorated. There was a desk, old but well cared for, with a leather chair that had seen better days. On the walls hung framed photographs of the neighborhood from decades ago and hand-drawn architectural sketches on yellowing paper. I recognized the handwriting on the sketches. I'd seen it on the letter Anderson had given me, the one from my grandfather. These were his drawings, his plans for buildings he'd designed or renovated, his vision for how spaces could serve communities. On the desk sat a sealed envelope with my name written in that same handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter inside was brief, dated 33 years ago, written when I was barely old enough to walk. Allison, it read. If you're reading this, it means you found your way here. This was my first office where I started my business with nothing but hope and determination. I've asked Robert to preserve it for you, not because I want you to live in the past, but because I want you to know where you come from. You come from people who built things that mattered. I built this for you. Make it yours. With all my love, Grandfather Richard. I sat in his chair and cried. For the grandfather I barely remembered. For the 30 years I'd spent believing I came from people who saw me as worthless. For the alternate history where he'd lived long enough to protect me himself, instead of having to arrange protection from beyond the grave. Anderson found me there an hour later. He stood in the doorway looking at the preserved office with an expression of profound sadness. He made me promise to buy this building when it came on the market, he said quietly. He rented this space when he was 26 years old and starting out, kept the office here for 15 years, even after his business grew and he could afford better. He had me purchase the building 12 years ago, specifically so this room would be waiting for you when you were ready. He couldn't have known I'd be ready, I said, or that I'd even want this. He knew you, Anderson corrected. He saw the person you were becoming even when you were 5 years old. He had faith in who you'd be. I kept that office as my workspace while I transformed the rest of the building. I brought in the bookstore cafe first, a woman-owned business run by a former librarian who dreamed of creating a community gathering space. Then came the Textile Arts Cooperative, 6 women in their 60s and 70s who'd been meeting in church basements to quilt and weave and had been looking for a permanent home. The Wellness Center specialized in affordable services for seniors, gentle yoga, massage therapy, health education classes. Within 2 months, occupancy hit 70%. Within 4 months, we were at full capacity with a waiting list. The community room hosted book clubs, art classes, educational seminars on everything from estate planning to smartphone basics. Women who'd been isolated in their homes started coming in daily, not because they needed to buy anything, but because the building had become their third space, their community hub. The local newspaper ran a feature calling it a community-focused renovation that puts people before profits. A neighborhood blog interviewed me about my strategic vision. Anderson's company newsletter featured the project as a model for thoughtful development. I was visible, my name was out there, and my family was paying attention. One day they showed up right at the building's entrance. I was in a tenant meeting with the bookstore owner discussing plans for expanding her cafe seating when Wendy appeared in the doorway. Wendy was my assistant, a competent woman in her early 60s who'd worked in property management for decades and rarely looked rattled. But right now, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "Allison," she said, her voice tight. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are people in the lobby demanding to see you. They're causing quite a scene and they won't leave." I knew before she said another word, the way her eyes held mine with apologetic concern, the careful neutrality in her voice that barely masked distress. I excused myself from the meeting and followed Wendy to the lobby, my stomach already knotting with familiar dread. They'd positioned themselves for maximum impact. My mother stood in the center of the lobby, her voice echoing off the original tin ceiling as she interrogated the front desk receptionist about my role here, my salary, who owned the building. My father had cornered one of the maintenance staff demanding to speak with whoever was in charge, his tone authoritative and condescending in that way he'd perfected over years of middle management. My sister circled the space like a journalist on assignment, photographing everything with her phone, the renovated architectural details, the community bulletin board, the directory listing my name as property director. Tenants and visitors had stopped what they were doing. The bookstore owner stood in her doorway, watching with concern. 2 women from the textile cooperative had frozen mid-conversation. The wellness center receptionist was trying very hard to look busy, while clearly listening to every word. "May I help you?" I said, my voice cutting through my mother's interrogation. She spun toward me, and I watched her face cycle through surprise calculation and then settle on righteous indignation. "There you are. We've been trying to reach you for days, Allison. Days. And now we find out this is where you've been hiding, running some kind of business you couldn't be bothered to tell your own family about. This is my workplace, I said evenly, and you're disrupting it. We should talk somewhere private. Private, my father's voice boomed across the lobby. So you can hide more secrets? I don't think so. We deserve answers, and we deserve them now. I looked at Wendy, at the receptionist, at the tenants watching this unfold, and made a decision. My office, now. All of you. I didn't wait to see if they'd follow. I walked to the elevator, rode it to the 3rd floor, and unlocked my office, the one that had been my grandfather's first workspace. They filed in behind me, my mother's critical gaze sweeping over the restored details, my sister still photographing, my father taking in the size of the space with an expression that mixed surprise with resentment. I closed the door and turned to face them. "How dare you?" my mother started before I could speak. "How dare you hide something like this from your family? A position like this, a building like this, and you couldn't even be bothered to mention it, while your father is unemployed and we're struggling to pay our mortgage." "We raised you," my father added, his face flushing red. "We gave you everything, fed you, clothed, you put a roof over your head for 18 years. And this is how you repay us, by sneaking around behind our backs, building some career you're ashamed to share with your own family." "I'm not ashamed," I said quietly. "Then why hide it?" Emily demanded, holding up her phone with photos of the lobby. "Why let us think you were barely surviving when you're apparently managing a whole building? Do you have any idea how that makes us look? How humiliating it is to find out our own family member has been lying to us?" The narrative they'd constructed was impressive in its complete inversion of reality. In their version, I was the villain. My success was something stolen from them through deception. My silence about my professional life was a betrayal rather than self-protection. My refusal to fund their financial crisis was abandonment rather than boundary setting. "This success came from the family values we instilled in you," my mother continued, her voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd heard my entire childhood. "Your work ethic, your sense of responsibility, those came from us, from the way we raised you. And now that you're finally doing well, you have a duty to help the family that made you who you are." "We deserve compensation," my father said, and the bluntness of it was almost refreshing after all the manipulation. "For the years we supported you, for the investment we made in raising you. You owe us, Allison, and it's time you paid that debt." I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw it clearly for the first time. They genuinely believed what they were saying. In their minds, they had been good parents who'd made sacrifices. My success was proof of their excellent parenting, and my resources were family assets they had every right to access. The fact that they'd spent 30 years treating me as their greatest disappointment didn't contradict this narrative in their minds, it enhanced it. They'd turned garbage into gold through their superior parenting, and now they deserved their share of the profits. "You need to leave," I said, my voice quiet but steel hard. "This is my workplace. You're disrupting my business and distressing my staff and tenants. Leave now or I'll have you removed." "Have us removed?" My mother's voice rose to a near shriek. "We're your family. You can't just throw us out like we're strangers." "You have no right to kick us out," my father added. "We came here for a reasonable conversation about family obligations, about doing what's right." "Family has rights," Emily said, her voice taking on that sweet venom I knew so well. "You can't just pretend we don't exist because it's convenient for you." I walked to my desk and picked up the phone. "Security. This is Allison Torres. I have 3 individuals in my office who've been asked to leave and are refusing. Could you please send someone to the 3rd floor?" "You wouldn't dare," my mother said, but her eyes had gone wide. "I absolutely would," I replied. The security guard arrived within 2 minutes. Marcus was a retired police officer, professional and unflappable. "Ma'am," he said to me, ignoring my family entirely. "These 3 need to be escorted from the building," I said. "They're no longer welcome on the property." "This is outrageous," my father shouted. "I'm her father. You can't treat me like some criminal." "Sir, you need to come with me," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "All of you, now." My mother's face contorted with rage. "After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed, this is how you treat your own mother." Marcus gestured toward the door. My father went first, still sputtering protests. Emily followed, her phone still out, recording everything for whatever purpose she had in mind. My mother was last, and as she passed through the doorway, she turned back to me with an expression of pure hatred. And then my mother said the sentence that broke something inside me. "I never wanted you," my mother said, her voice cold and clear-pitched to carry across the office. "You were a mistake that cost me my career, my freedom, everything I could have been. I should have given you away when I had the chance." The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with precision in places that had never quite healed. Marcus had his hand on her elbow, trying to guide her toward the hallway, but she shook him off with a violence that made him step back cautiously. "Do you understand me, Allison?" She took a step back into the office, her face twisted with decades of resentment finally given voice. "You weren't wanted. You were never wanted. Every day of your childhood, every meal I made, every piece of clothing I bought, every roof I put over your head was a sacrifice I resented. You were the anchor that drowned my ambitions, the burden that ruined my life." Emily laughed. Actually laughed, a sharp bark of amusement that echoed off the walls. "Oh my God, finally. Everyone's always known that, Allison. Why do you think you were treated differently? It's because you were different. You were the mistake. The accident. The kid Mom got stuck with when she still had dreams." I stood frozen behind my desk, my hands gripping the edge so hard my knuckles went white. 30 years of questions suddenly had an answer. Not the answer I'd hoped for, even in my darkest moments, but an answer that made terrible, clarifying sense. "I had a career path," my mother continued, and now there was something almost gleeful in her cruelty, as if saying these words out loud after holding them in for decades was a relief. "I was being considered for a major promotion. I was going to travel to build something that mattered, and then I got pregnant with you. Unplanned, unwanted, and your father in his infinite weakness convinced me to keep you, said it was the right thing to do, the moral thing." My father, still in the hallway, said nothing. His silence was its own confirmation. "So I kept you," she said, her voice dripping with bitterness, "and I watched my career evaporate. I watched my friends advance while I was stuck at home with a child I never wanted. I watched opportunities pass me by because I had you to take care of. Every single day, you were a reminder of everything I'd lost, everything I'd never get back. That's why we had Emily." My father finally spoke, his voice defensive. "To do it right the second time. To have a child we planned for. A child we actually wanted." The casual cruelty of it, the matter-of-fact tone, was somehow worse than my mother's venom. He was simply stating what he believed to be fact. Emily was the wanted child. I was the mistake they'd been forced to endure. "Nothing you ever did was enough because you were never supposed to exist in the first place," my mother said, and I could see she meant for this to destroy me. "Your achievements. They weren't impressive. They were barely adequate for someone who derailed my entire life. Your failures. They were confirmation that I'd been right all along, that you were a burden not worth carrying." Marcus tried again to escort her out more firmly this time, and my father moved to follow. But my mother had one more thing to say. She looked back at me with an expression of pure contempt. "And now you want to play the victim, the poor mistreated daughter? You owe us everything, Allison. Everything. We gave you life when we should have chosen differently. The least you can do is help support the family that made the mistake of keeping you." Then she was gone. Marcus finally succeeding in moving all three of them toward the elevator. I could hear my mother's voice echoing down the hallway, still listing grievances, still demanding recognition for the sacrifice of not giving me up for adoption. I stood in the office my grandfather had preserved for me, in the building he'd arranged for me to have surrounded by the success I'd built despite them, and felt something fundamental break inside my chest. Not my spirit, not my determination, but the last fragile thread of hope I'd been carrying without realizing it. The hope that maybe somehow they'd loved me even badly. The hope that their cruelty came from frustration or stress or misunderstanding rather than from the simple fact that they'd never wanted me to exist. The clarity was devastating and liberating in equal measure. I owed them nothing. Not gratitude for raising me when they'd resented every moment of it. Not financial support for people who'd viewed me as a life-ruining mistake. Not another second of my time or energy trying to earn love from people fundamentally incapable of giving it. I sat down in my grandfather's chair, the one piece of furniture I'd kept from the original office, and let the truth settle over me. They'd said it out loud now, made it explicit. There was no going back from words like that, no way to pretend they'd been said in anger, and didn't reflect their true feelings. My phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet office. I almost didn't answer my emotional capacity, completely exhausted, but the caller ID made me pause. Aunt Rosa. My mother's sister, a woman I'd seen perhaps a dozen times in my life, always at family events where she stayed on the periphery, kind but distant. I'd always assumed she shared the family's opinion of me and simply had better manners about expressing it. I answered on the fourth ring. "Hello." "Allison." Her voice was shaking, urgent in a way that made me sit up straighter. "Thank God. I just heard about what happened at your building. Your mother called me boasting about what she said to you. Allison, we need to talk immediately. Right now. There are things about your mother you don't know. Terrible things she's done. Things I should have told you years ago, but I was too afraid. Aunt Rosa, I really can't. Your mother lied to you about everything." Rosa interrupted her words, tumbling out in a rush. "About your grandfather, about his will, about your inheritance. She didn't just hide opportunities from you, Allison. She stole them, deliberately, systematically, for 30 years. My hand tightened on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "I have proof," she said. "Documents, recordings, evidence of fraud and forgery and theft that goes back to before you were born. Your grandfather tried to protect you, but your mother found ways around every safeguard he put in place, and I watched it happen. I knew, and I said nothing because I was terrified of her, and I've carried that guilt for 3 decades. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not after what she just said to you." My office suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. "Aunt Rosa, your mother is not just cruel, Allison. She's criminal, and it's time you knew the truth." It was my Aunt Rosa, and she said, "You need to know the truth." "Can you come to my house?" Rosa's voice cracked with urgency. "I have documents you need to see. Things I should have shown you years ago. Please, Allison. This can't wait." I gave her my address instead. I couldn't leave the building, not with my staff still processing what they'd witnessed, not with tenants who deserved an explanation. Rosa agreed immediately and arrived 40 minutes later, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had been hidden in an attic for decades. She was smaller than I remembered, a thin woman in her late 60s with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands trembled as she set the briefcase on my desk, and when she looked at me, her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with shame. "I'm so sorry," she said before anything else. "For 30 years I've been sorry. I watched what she did to you. I saw how differently you were treated compared to Emily. I knew it was wrong and I said nothing. I did nothing. And that makes me complicit in every cruel thing that happened to you." "Why didn't you say something?" I asked, not accusingly but genuinely trying to understand. "Because I was terrified of your mother," Rosa admitted, sinking into the chair across from my desk. "My sister has always been able to manipulate people, to turn family against each other, to isolate anyone who challenges her. When you were 5 years old, I tried to intervene once. I pulled her aside at a family gathering and told her she was treating you unfairly. Do you know what she did?" I shook my head. "She called the entire family together and told them I'd accused her of being a bad mother. She cried. She performed this whole breakdown about how hard she was trying, how stressed she was, how hurtful it was to be attacked by her own sister when she was doing her best. Within a week, I was uninvited from family events. Relatives stopped calling me. My own mother took your mother's side and told me I needed to apologize. I was completely cut off." Rosa's voice broke. "It took me 6 months of groveling to be allowed back into the family, and the condition was that I never questioned your mother's parenting again, never interfered, never even showed you too much attention because that might suggest I thought you needed extra support. So I stayed silent. I came to family events and I watched you suffer and I smiled and pretended everything was fine because I was too much of a coward to risk being cast out again. I understand, I said quietly, and I did. I'd lived my entire life understanding the cost of challenging my mother. But there's more, Rosa continued, opening the briefcase with shaking hands. Things that go beyond emotional abuse, things that are criminal. She pulled out a manila folder yellowed with age and set it on my desk. Your grandfather's real will, or rather a copy of it. I was there when he had it drawn up 7 months before he died. He asked me to be a witness. I opened the folder carefully. The document inside was a photocopy, faded but legible, dated 33 years ago. My hands went cold as I read the opening paragraph. I, Richard Michael Torres, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate to my granddaughter, Allison Marie Torres, to be held in trust until she reaches the age of 30 years. He left everything to you, Rosa said. The house, the investment accounts, the business assets, all of it. He was very specific about his reasoning, and he included it in a letter that was supposed to be attached to the will. He'd witnessed your mother's cruelty firsthand. He'd seen how she treated you versus how she doted on Emily, even though Emily was barely 2 years old at the time. He knew his daughter was damaged, and he wanted to protect you from her. But this isn't the will that was probated, I said, my mind racing. After he died, I remember hearing that he'd left everything to his daughter, to my mother. Because your mother hid the real will and presented a forgery, Rosa said. A will that she'd had created before your grandfather changed his mind. She found the real will in his safe deposit box after he died, saw that you were the sole heir, and destroyed it. Then she presented the old version that left everything to her as his daughter, with the expectation that she'd provide for all her children equally. The room felt like it was tilting. How do you know this? Because she told me, Rosa said simply. She called me 2 days after his funeral, drunk and triumphant, and confessed the whole thing. She said you were never going to take away what should have been hers, that your grandfather had been senile and manipulated, that she'd fixed his mistake. She was laughing Allison, laughing about defrauding her own child. I stared at the photocopy at my grandfather's signature at the witness lines that bore Rosa's name and someone else's I didn't recognize. Why didn't you go to the police report the fraud? Because I had no proof beyond a photocopy that could have been faked, Rosa said. And because she made it very clear what would happen if I tried. She'd destroy me, turn the entire family against me, make sure I never saw my nieces or my mother again. She had the original will, all the legal documents, and a lawyer who'd helped her with the forgery. I was one woman with a copy and no resources to fight her. Who was the lawyer? I asked. Rosa's face darkened. Not a lawyer. Someone worse. Someone with power and money and his own reasons for wanting to help your mother hide the truth. She pulled out another document, this one more recent, a printed email dated 5 years ago. Your mother kept in touch with him over the years. This is from his private email to hers discussing how to handle inquiries from your grandfather's old business partners about estate distribution. He advised her on legal strategies to prevent anyone from questioning the will's authenticity. I scanned the email, noting the casual tone, the clear familiarity between them, the way they discussed blocking potential investigations, as if they were planning a dinner party. Who is he? I asked. Rosa took a breath. He's a CEO now, very powerful, very connected. When your mother needed help hiding the will, he was a rising executive with access to resources and connections. He helped her forge documents, create false paper trails, and silence anyone who might have asked questions. In exchange, she gave him something he wanted. What? A relationship that wasn't appropriate then and isn't appropriate now, Rosa said carefully. They've been involved on and off for 35 years, since before you were born. Before your parents' marriage was even stable, this man has been in your mother's life the entire time, helping her maintain the fraud, benefiting from the assets that should have been yours. My stomach turned. Does my father know? "Your father knows everything and says nothing," Rosa replied. "He's known about the affair. He's known about the stolen will. He's known because he was the other witness on the real Will Allison. His signature is right there next to mine. He knew your grandfather wanted everything to go to you, and he watched your mother destroy that will and claim the estate for herself, and he said nothing because he's always been too weak to stand up to her." I looked back at the document at the second witness signature I hadn't fully processed before. David Torres, my father's name in his handwriting, certifying that my grandfather had been of sound mind when he disinherited my mother in favor of me. "The original will still exists," Rosa said. "The CEO has it. He's kept it in his private safe all these years as insurance, as leverage over your mother, as proof of their conspiracy if it ever became necessary to protect himself. She trusted him with the most incriminating evidence because they were partners in this fraud." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you're 30 years old," Rosa said. "The age your grandfather specified for the trust to transfer to you, and because I can't carry this guilt anymore. I've watched you build a life despite everything they did to you, and after what your mother said to you today, I realized that my silence was its own form of abuse. You deserve the truth. You deserve everything that was stolen from you." She pulled out one more document, a handwritten note. "This is the name and contact information for your grandfather's original attorney, the one who drafted the real will. He's retired now, but he'll remember the case. He'll testify if needed. And this," she tapped the photocopy, "is your proof that the will existed." I looked at her. This woman who'd carried 30 years of guilt and fear, who'd finally found the courage to do what she should have done 3 decades ago. And then Aunt Rosa whispered the name of the CEO involved, and I nearly dropped my phone. "Marcus Hendricks," Rosa said, and the name meant nothing to me for a moment until she added, "CEO of Hendricks Development Corporation, one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the East Coast." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I'd heard that name, read about the company in industry publications. They were major players, influential enough that crossing them meant professional suicide in certain circles. "He's been your mother's lover for 35 years. Rosa continued, her voice steady now that the worst was out. "They met when your mother was 22, and he was a junior executive climbing the corporate ladder. Your father knew about the affair, but stayed in the marriage anyway because leaving would have meant admitting he'd failed, and your father has never been able to admit failure." "Emily," I said, the pieces suddenly clicking together with sickening clarity. "You're saying Emily is Marcus Hendricks' biological daughter," Rosa confirmed. "Your mother got pregnant during one of their affairs. She convinced your father the baby was his, or maybe he knew the truth and chose to pretend otherwise. Either way, Emily is the child of your mother's great love affair, the daughter she actually wanted, the one she and Marcus both doted on because she represented their relationship." That explained everything. The favoritism that had been so extreme, it bordered on parody. The way my mother looked at Emily versus how she looked at me. The resources poured into Emily's education appearance opportunities, while I was given hand-me-downs and told to be grateful. Emily wasn't just the wanted child. She was the loved child, the product of the relationship my mother actually valued. "When your grandfather changed his will to leave everything to you," Rosa said, "your mother panicked. She knew that if you inherited the estate at 30, you'd be financially independent. She'd lose all control over you. Worse, you might discover the truth about the original will, about the fraud, about everything. So she called Marcus and asked for help. And he helped her because Emily would inherit in my place," I finished. "Exactly. They destroyed the real will together, presented the forgery, and split the estate assets. Your mother kept most of it initially, but over the years she's been transferring portions to Emily through various trusts and shell accounts. And Marcus has been facilitating all of it, using his corporate resources and legal connections to make sure the fraud was never discovered." Rosa reached into her briefcase again and pulled out something I hadn't expected, an old VHS tape in a cracked plastic case. "There's more," she said. "Your grandfather didn't trust a simple paper will to protect you. He was too smart for that. He knew your mother well enough to anticipate she might try something, so he made this." She handed me the tape. "Video will" was written on the label in my grandfather's handwriting, along with a date, August 15th, 33 years ago, 2 years before he died. "He recorded this when you were 5 years old," Rosa explained. "I was there when he did it. He'd just witnessed your mother slap you across the face during a family birthday party because you'd accidentally spilled juice on her dress. It wasn't hard, but it was deliberate, and the look in your mother's eyes frightened him. That's when he knew he had to protect you legally, not just financially." My hand trembled holding the tape. "I don't have a VCR." "I brought one," Rosa said, pulling an ancient player from her briefcase, along with the necessary cables. "I knew you'd need to see this." It took 10 minutes to connect the player to my office television. The video quality was poor, grainy, and washed out in the way of old home recordings, but my grandfather's face was unmistakable. He sat in what looked like a lawyer's office, wearing a suit and tie, his expression serious, but his eyes warm. "Allison," he began, and hearing his voice after so many years made my throat tight. "If you're watching this recording, it means I'm gone, and they've hidden the truth. I need you to know several things. First, I loved you very much. You were the brightest light in my later years, and watching you grow brought me more joy than I can express." He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "Second, I changed my will today to leave my entire estate to you, to be held in trust until you turn 30 years old. I did this because I witnessed your mother hurt you, and I realized she doesn't love you the way a mother should. She resents you. I've seen it in her eyes, heard it in her voice when she talks about you. She treats you as a burden, and that will only get worse as you grow older." His voice hardened. "I don't trust my daughter with your well-being or your future, so I've made legal provisions to protect you. Everything I own will be yours when you're old enough to fight for it, old enough to understand what it means, old enough to stand against whatever opposition she'll mount when the truth comes out." The video continued for another 3 minutes. My grandfather explained the terms of the trust, named his attorney specified that Anderson was to be the executor who would ensure I received everything when I turned 30. He talked about his hope for my future, his belief in my intelligence and strength, his regret that he wouldn't be alive to see me become the woman he knew I'd be. "They'll try to tell you that you're worthless," he said near the end, his voice gentle but firm, "that you're a failure, a disappointment, not good enough. Don't believe them, Allison. You come from strong people. You have my blood in your veins, and that means you're a fighter. Use that strength. Claim what's yours, and know that somewhere I'm proud of you." The screen went black. I sat in silence for a long moment, tears running down my face, grieving for a grandfather I'd barely known, but who'd loved me enough to fight for me from beyond the grave. "The legal situation is complicated," Rosa said gently. "The video is powerful evidence of your grandfather's intent, but it's not a legal will by itself. The photocopy of the written will shows you as the sole heir, but a good lawyer could argue it's a forgery since I'm family and might have motivation to create false documents." "What about the original?" I asked. "Marcus still has it," Rosa confirmed. "He's kept it in his private safe at his home for 3 decades. It's insurance for him leverage over your mother if their relationship ever sours. But it's also proof that the will probated after your grandfather's death was fraudulent. If we can get our hands on that original, with its notarized signatures and legal seals, we have an airtight case. Getting it means going up against one of the most powerful executives in the region," I said. "Yes," Rosa agreed. "It means legal warfare, criminal accusations of fraud and forgery. It means your mother and Marcus will use every resource at their disposal to destroy your credibility, to paint you as a delusional daughter, making false accusations against her family. It will be ugly and public and potentially ruinous." I looked at the frozen image of my grandfather on the television screen, at the trust in his eyes, at the love he'd tried to protect me with. And the most shocking part, my father was one of the witnesses who signed it. I stared at my father's signature on the photocopy, the careful cursive that certified he'd witnessed my grandfather's last will and testament, the one that left everything to me. He'd stood in that lawyer's office 33 years ago and watched his father-in-law explicitly disinherit his own daughter in favor of his granddaughter. He'd signed his name affirming that Richard Torres was of sound mind and clear intent, and then he'd watched his wife destroy that will and claim the estate for herself, and he'd said nothing. "Your father isn't evil," Rosa said quietly, reading my expression. "He's weak. There's a difference, though. I'm not sure that difference matters much to you right now." "Tell me," I said. "Tell me how he justified this." Rosa settled back in her chair, looking older than she had when she'd arrived. "Your mother discovered the affair she'd been having with Marcus was about to be exposed. Someone had seen them together, someone who might have told your father. She panicked and confessed to your father herself, but with a twist. She told him she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd been seduced by an older, powerful man when she was vulnerable, that she regretted it desperately, and it would never happen again." "And he believed her." "He wanted to believe her," Rosa corrected. "Your father's entire identity was built on being the stable provider, the good husband, the family man. Admitting his wife had been unfaithful would have shattered that identity. So he chose to believe her performance of remorse, and she used that choice as leverage for the next 3 decades. I felt sick. How? Every time he questioned her about how she treated you, about financial decisions, about anything, she'd remind him of his choice to forgive her affair. She'd say things like, "After I made my mistake and you were gracious enough to stay, you owe me the benefit of the doubt." Or, "I can't believe you're questioning me when you know how guilty I still feel about betraying you." She weaponized his forgiveness, turned it into a debt she could call in whenever she needed compliance. "What about the will?" I asked. "When grandfather died and she presented that forgery, he must have known it was wrong." "He did," Rosa confirmed. "I was there when she told him what she'd done. She didn't ask for his permission or his help. She simply informed him that she'd destroyed the real will and would be probating the old one, and if he had a problem with that, she'd make sure the entire family knew about her affair, including the detail that he'd known about it for years and stayed anyway. She'd paint him as weak and pathetic, destroy his reputation, turn his own forgiveness into evidence of his inadequacy." The cruelty was breathtaking. "So he chose silence." "He chose self-preservation," Rosa said. "Is that better than what your mother did? No. But it's different. Your mother is actively malicious. Your father is passively complicit. Both betrayed you, but from different motivations." I thought about all the times my father had stood by while my mother belittled me, all the moments he could have intervened, and didn't all the years he'd watched me suffer and done nothing. Knowing now that it came from cowardice rather than malice didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it hurt more. Malice, I could understand. Cowardice felt like a waste. "There's more you need to know about the scope of this," Rosa continued, pulling out another folder. "This is what I've been able to document over the years. Financial transactions that don't make sense. Transfers from your mother's accounts to Emily's, despite Emily having no legitimate income source. Shell companies that Marcus helped set up. Properties purchased under false names." I opened the folder and found myself looking at spreadsheets Rosa had painstakingly created, tracking money movements over 25 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from accounts that should have been mine into accounts controlled by my mother and sister, laundered through corporate structures designed to obscure the origin of the funds. "This isn't just about a hidden will," I said, the full picture finally becoming clear. "This is organized financial fraud." "Exactly," Rosa said. "Your mother didn't just steal your inheritance once by hiding a will. She's been systematically looting the estate assets for decades, transferring them to herself and Emily, while claiming their family funds being distributed fairly. She's forged your grandfather's signature on documents. She's created false tax records. Marcus has used his corporate infrastructure to make it all look legitimate." "They could go to prison for this," I said. "If you can prove it, yes," Rosa agreed. "Marcus especially. He's not just complicit, he's been actively orchestrating the financial structures to hide the fraud. Corporate fraud, money laundering, potentially even tax evasion if the offshore accounts I suspect exist are ever found. We're talking about serious federal crimes." I sat back, trying to process the magnitude of what I was facing. This wasn't just a family dispute over an estate. This was a criminal conspiracy spanning 3 decades, involving powerful people with extensive resources to defend themselves. If I came forward with these allegations and couldn't prove them absolutely, I'd be destroyed, sued for defamation, blacklisted professionally, turned into the villain of my own story. But I wasn't the powerless child anymore. I had allies now. Anderson, who'd been protecting me on my grandfather's behalf for 30 years and had corporate resources of his own. Rosa, who'd finally found the courage to come forward with evidence and testimony. I had my own money earned through my own skill, untouchable by my mother's schemes. I had a successful business that proved my competence. I had legal standing and a legitimate claim. I need to hire people. I said my mind, already working through next steps. Investigators who specialize in financial fraud, attorneys who handle inheritance disputes and white-collar crime. I need to build a case so airtight that they can't wriggle out of it through technicalities or legal maneuvering. I can help with that, Rosa said. I have contacts, people who owe me favors, and I have 30 years of guilt motivating me to do whatever it takes to make this right. Why now? I asked her. Why wait 30 years to come forward? She met my eyes, and I saw the shame there, but also something harder, determination. Because for 30 years, you were a child, then a young adult struggling to build a life despite them. You weren't ready for this fight. You didn't have the resources or the resilience to take them on. But now you're 30 years old, exactly the age your grandfather specified. Now you're successful and strong and surrounded by allies. Now you can win. And I refuse to let another day pass where they continue to profit from what they stole from you. I looked down at the documents spread across my desk. The photocopy of the will, the video testimony, the financial records showing decades of fraud. The pieces were there, but they needed to be assembled into something undeniable, something that would hold up in court against the best lawyers Marcus's money could buy. But before I could act, I needed undeniable proof. I stared at my father's signature on the photocopy, the careful cursive that certified he'd witnessed my grandfather's last will and testament, the one that left everything to me. He'd stood in that lawyer's office 33 years ago and watched his father-in-law explicitly disinherit his own daughter in favor of his granddaughter. He'd signed his name affirming that Richard Torres was of sound mind and clear intent. And then he'd watched his wife destroy that will and claim the estate for herself, and he'd said nothing. "Your father isn't evil," Rosa said quietly, reading my expression. "He's weak. There's a difference, though. I'm not sure that difference matters much to you right now." "Tell me," I said. "Tell me how he justified this." Rosa settled back in her chair, looking older than she had when she'd arrived. "Your mother discovered the affair she'd been having with Marcus was about to be exposed. Someone had seen them together, someone who might have told your father. She panicked and confessed to your father herself, but with a twist. She told him she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd been seduced by an older, powerful man when she was vulnerable, that she regretted it desperately, and it would never happen again." "And he believed her. He wanted to believe her," Rosa corrected. "Your father's entire identity was built on being the stable provider, the good husband, the family man. Admitting his wife had been unfaithful would have shattered that identity, so he chose to believe her performance of remorse, and she used that choice as leverage for the next 3 decades. I felt sick. Every time he questioned her about how she treated you, about financial decisions, about anything, she'd remind him of his choice to forgive her affair. She'd say things like, 'After I made my mistake, and you were gracious enough to stay, you owe me the benefit of the doubt.' Or, 'I can't believe you're questioning me when you know how guilty I still feel about betraying you.' She weaponized his forgiveness, turned it into a debt she could call in whenever she needed compliance." "What about the will?" I asked. "When grandfather died and she presented that forgery, he must have known it was wrong." "He did," Rosa confirmed. "I was there when she told him what she'd done. She didn't ask for his permission or his help. She simply informed him that she'd destroyed the real will and would be probating the old one, and if he had a problem with that, she'd make sure the entire family knew about her affair, including the detail that he'd known about it for years and stayed anyway. She'd paint him as weak and pathetic, destroy his reputation, turn his own forgiveness into evidence of his inadequacy. The cruelty was breathtaking. So he chose silence. He chose self-preservation, Rosa said. Is that better than what your mother did? No, but it's different. Your mother is actively malicious. Your father is passively complicit. Both betrayed you, but from different motivations. I thought about all the times my father had stood by while my mother belittled me, all the moments he could have intervened, and didn't, all the years he'd watched me suffer and done nothing. Knowing now that it came from cowardice rather than malice didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it hurt more. Malice I could understand. Cowardice felt like a waste. There's more you need to know about the scope of this. Rosa continued, pulling out another folder. This is what I've been able to document over the years. Financial transactions that don't make sense. Transfers from your mother's accounts to Emily's, despite Emily having no legitimate income source. Shell companies that Marcus helped set up. Properties purchased under false names. I opened the folder and found myself looking at spreadsheets Rosa had painstakingly created, tracking money movements over 25 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from accounts that should have been mine into accounts controlled by my mother and sister, laundered through corporate structures designed to obscure the origin of the funds. This isn't just about a hidden will, I said, the full picture finally becoming clear. This is organized financial fraud. Exactly, Rosa said. Your mother didn't just steal your inheritance once by hiding a will. She's been systematically looting the estate assets for decades, transferring them to herself and Emily, while claiming their family funds being distributed fairly. She's forged your grandfather's signature on documents. She's created false tax records. Marcus has used his corporate infrastructure to make it all look legitimate. They could go to prison for this, I said. If you can prove it, yes, Rosa agreed. Marcus especially. He's not just complicit. He's been actively orchestrating the financial structures to hide the fraud. Corporate fraud, money laundering, potentially even tax evasion, if the offshore accounts I suspect exist are ever found. We're talking about serious federal crimes. I sat back trying to process the magnitude of what I was facing. This wasn't just a family dispute over an estate. This was a criminal conspiracy spanning 3 decades involving powerful people with extensive resources to defend themselves. If I came forward with these allegations and couldn't prove them absolutely, I'd be destroyed, sued for defamation, blacklisted professionally, turned into the villain of my own story. But I wasn't the powerless child anymore. I had allies now. Anderson, who'd been protecting me on my grandfather's behalf for 30 years and had corporate resources of his own. Rosa, who'd finally found the courage to come forward with evidence and testimony. I had my own money earned through my own skill, untouchable by my mother's schemes. I had a successful business that proved my competence. I had legal standing and a legitimate claim. I need to hire people, I said, my mind already working through next steps. Investigators who specialize in financial fraud, attorneys who handle inheritance disputes and white-collar crime. I need to build a case so airtight that they can't wriggle out of it through technicalities or legal maneuvering. I can help with that, Rosa said. I have contacts, people who owe me favors, and I have 30 years of guilt motivating me to do whatever it takes to make this right. Why now? I asked her. Why wait 30 years to come forward? She met my eyes, and I saw the shame there, but also something harder. Determination. Because for 30 years you were a child then, a young adult struggling to build a life despite them. You weren't ready for this fight. You didn't have the resources or the resilience to take them on. But now you're 30 years old, exactly the age your grandfather specified. Now you're successful and strong and surrounded by allies. Now you can win. And I refuse to let another day pass where they continue to profit from what they stole from you. I looked down at the documents spread across my desk. The photocopy of the will. The video testimony, the financial records showing decades of fraud. The pieces were there, but they needed to be assembled into something undeniable, something that would hold up in court against the best lawyers Marcus's money could buy. But before I could act, I needed undeniable proof. The investigator I hired was a former FBI agent named Catherine Walsh, who specialized in white-collar financial crimes. She took Rose's documentation and my grandfather's video and spent 3 weeks building a comprehensive case file. When she presented her findings, the evidence was damning enough to make a prosecutor salivate. Forged signatures on estate documents, fraudulent transfers totaling over $800,000. Shell companies created specifically to launder inheritance funds. Email trails between my mother and Marcus discussing how to hide assets. Bank records showing Emily receiving regular deposits despite having no reported income. But Catherine confirmed what I already suspected without the original will that Marcus kept in his private safe. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. They'd argue the photocopy was fabricated. The video was recorded under duress, that my grandfather had been manipulated in his final years. We needed that original document with its notarized seal and official witness signatures, which meant I needed my family to panic enough to make mistakes. I sent the email on a Tuesday morning, keeping the message simple and professional. Family meeting required to discuss estate matters and potential legal resolution. Saturday, 10 a.m., my attorney's conference room. Attendance mandatory. I included the address of Catherine's law office and nothing else. They arrived exactly on time, which told me they'd been discussing strategy all week. My mother wore her most expensive suit, the one she saved for occasions when she needed to project authority. My father looked haggard, like he hadn't slept. Emily had her phone out ready to record, though she'd have to put it away once we entered the conference room. They walked in expecting me to be alone, perhaps desperate, ready to negotiate from weakness. Instead, they found me seated at a long mahogany table, flanked by Catherine on one side and Marcus Chen, my newly retained attorney, on the other. Marcus was a partner at one of the city's most respected law firms, known for his work on complex estate litigation. His presence alone sent a message about how serious this was. The smugness on my mother's face flickered when she saw the setup, but she recovered quickly. "Allison, this is quite dramatic. I hope you haven't wasted these people's time with whatever fantasy you've concocted." "Please sit," Marcus said, his tone professionally neutral. "We have a significant amount of material to cover." They sat my mother and Emily on one side of the table, my father slightly apart from them, as if trying to maintain distance. I watched them arrange themselves, saw my mother's hand reach over to squeeze Emily's, in reassurance, saw my father's eyes dart to the stack of folders on the table. "We're here to discuss the estate of Richard Torres," I began, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Specifically, the fraudulent probate of his will 33 years ago, and the systematic theft of assets that should have been held in trust for me." "That's absurd," my mother said immediately. "Your grandfather left his estate to me, his daughter. The will was properly probated. This is a waste of everyone's time." "Let's look at the evidence," I said, and nodded to Catherine. She opened the first folder and slid documents across the table. These are bank records showing transfers from accounts in Patricia Torres's name to accounts belonging to Emily Torres over a 25-year period. The total transferred amounts to $643,000. Emily Torres has no reported employment income that would explain deposits of this size. Emily's face went pale. "Those are gifts. From my mother. That's perfectly legal." "Gifts from what source?" Catherine asked. "Your mother's reported income over this period wouldn't support transfers of this magnitude while maintaining her lifestyle, unless the source of funds was an estate she controlled but didn't legally own." "This is speculation," my mother snapped, but I could hear the edge of panic in her voice. Marcus slid another folder forward. "This is a photocopy of Richard Torres's actual last will and testament, dated 7 months before his death, leaving his entire estate in trust to Allison Torres. The document bears witness signatures from Rosa Martinez and David Torres." He looked directly at my father. "Your signature, Mr. Torres." My father's hands trembled on the table. He didn't look up, didn't speak, just stared at his own signature, certifying a will he'd helped conceal for 3 decades. "That's a forgery," my mother said, but her voice had lost its confidence. "Anyone could have created a fake document." "Which is why we also have this," I said, and Catherine set up a laptop. The video began playing my grandfather's face, filling the screen, his voice clear and firm as he explained his intentions, his reasons for disinheriting his daughter, his love for his granddaughter. The conference room fell silent, except for my grandfather's recorded voice. I watched my mother's face cycle through shock, fury, and calculation. Emily had gone completely still, her phone forgotten on the table. My father had his eyes closed, as if he could make this disappear by not looking at it. When the video ended, Marcus spoke with devastating calm. "We have sufficient evidence to file criminal complaints with the district attorney's office for inheritance fraud, forgery of legal documents, and money laundering. Ms. Walsh's investigation has documented systematic financial crimes spanning 30 years. If prosecuted, the potential sentences range from 5 to 10 years in federal prison." "You're bluffing," my mother said, but she'd lost all color in her face. "I assure you we are not," Marcus replied. "However, there is a possibility of avoiding criminal prosecution if you cooperate fully in civil proceedings to restore the estate to its rightful heir. That would require immediate return of all misappropriated assets, full accounting of how the estate funds were distributed and spent, and signed admissions regarding the fraudulent probate." "You can't prove any of this," Emily said, but her voice shook. "You have a copy of a will that could be fake and an old video. That's not enough." "We also have witness testimony from Rosa Martinez, who was present when the will was created and when your mother confessed to destroying it," Catherine said. "We have financial forensics showing patterns consistent with fraud. And we have 30 years of your mother's threats to family members who question the estate distribution, which establishes consciousness of guilt." My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is extortion. You're trying to shake us down using fabricated evidence, and then Father stood up, his voice shaking. "Stop," my father said, and the word came out broken, barely more than a whisper, but somehow cutting through my mother's rising tirade. "Just stop, Patricia, please." My mother turned to him, fury blazing in her eyes. "David, sit down. Don't say another word." But he remained standing, swaying slightly, as if the weight of what he was about to do was physical. When he looked at me, his eyes were red-rimmed and full of something I'd never seen before. Shame so profound it seemed to age him a decade in that moment. "I knew," he said, his voice gaining strength through sheer force of will. "I knew about the real will from the beginning. I was there when your grandfather had it drawn up. I signed my name as a witness. I watched him record that video. I knew he wanted you to have everything, and I knew why. I saw how your mother treated you, and I understood his decision." "David," my mother hissed, warning in her voice. He ignored her, speaking directly to me for what felt like the first time in my life. "When your grandfather died, and your mother told me what she'd done, that she'd destroyed the will and was going to probate the old one instead, I should have gone to the authorities. I should have protected you. You were 7 years old and you'd just lost the one person in the family who actually loved you. And I let your mother steal your inheritance because I was too much of a coward to stand up to her." "You were not a coward," my mother said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "We made that decision together, for the good of the family." "No," my father said, and there was steel in his voice I'd never heard. "You made that decision, and you threatened me into silence. You told me that if I said anything, you'd tell everyone about the affair, about how I knew and stayed anyway, about how weak and pathetic I was. You said you'd turn the whole family against me, that you'd make sure I lost everything, my job, my reputation, my relationship with Emily. You held those threats over my head for 30 years. He turned to Marcus and Catherine. "She didn't just threaten me once. It was systematic, constant. Every time I questioned her about anything, how she treated Allison where the estate money was going, why Emily was getting everything while Allison got nothing, she'd remind me of what she could take away. She'd cry and say I was abandoning her after she'd forgiven my inadequacies as a husband. She'd rage and threaten to destroy me. She'd manipulate until I backed down, every single time. "This is ridiculous," Emily said, but she sounded uncertain now, looking at our father as if seeing him for the first time. "I was psychologically abused," my father continued, and his voice cracked. "I understand that now. I've spent the last few years in therapy trying to understand how I became someone who could watch his own daughter suffer and do nothing to stop it. And the answer is that I was systematically broken down by a woman who used my own weaknesses against me until I didn't have the strength to resist anymore." He looked at me again, tears now running down his face. "But that's not an excuse. It's an explanation, not a justification. I failed you, Allison. I failed you every day of your childhood. I watched her hurt you and I said nothing. I watched her steal from you and I did nothing. I am complicit in everything she did, and I will have to live with that for the rest of my life." The conference room was absolutely silent. Even my mother seemed shocked into stillness by this public dismantling of the family mythology. "There's something else you need to know," my father said, and his voice dropped lower. "Something I should have told you years ago. When you were 3 years old, your mother tried to give you up for adoption." I felt the words hit like a physical blow. "What?" "There was a couple, the Fosters, James and Margaret Foster. They'd been trying to adopt for years. Your mother contacted the agency and told them she couldn't handle being a mother, that she'd made a mistake, that you deserved a better home." She went through the entire process, the home visits, the paperwork, the preparation for transition. My mother had gone very still, her face pale. "You spent 3 weekends with them," my father continued. "Trial visits where you'd stay at their house, get to know them. And you loved them. You bonded with them so quickly it was remarkable. Margaret would send photos of you laughing, playing happy, in a way I'd never seen you at home. They were gentle people, kind people. They adored you." His voice broke completely. "And that's when your mother changed her mind. She saw how much they loved you, how happy you were, and she panicked. Not because she wanted you back out of love, but because she couldn't stand the idea of losing control, of you having a better life somewhere else, of people seeing that she'd given up her daughter." "That's a lie," my mother said, but her voice was weak. "She reclaimed you 2 days before the adoption was supposed to be finalized," my father said. "Told the agency she'd made a mistake, that she loved you too much to let you go. The Fosters were heartbroken. They'd already set up a bedroom for you. They'd been preparing to be your parents. And your mother ripped you away from them because her pride couldn't handle the judgment of admitting she didn't want her own child." I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. There had been a chance, a real chance at a family that actually wanted me, people who would have loved me without conditions, and it had been stolen from me, not out of maternal love, but out of vanity and control. "What happened to them?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The Fosters." My father reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, his hands shaking. "They never forgot you. They've tried to find you for 27 years. Your mother made sure they couldn't changing our address without forwarding information, keeping you off social media, blocking any attempts they made to reach out through legal channels. But they never stopped looking." He handed me the paper. It was a printout of a private investigator's report dated 6 months ago, detailing their search for Allison Marie Torres, last known contact at age 3, seeking to reconnect with the child they'd almost adopted. "I hired the investigator to find them," my father said quietly, "because I knew one day you'd need to know that there were people who wanted you, who chose you, who've been looking for you all this time." He met my eyes, and in his expression I saw genuine remorse mixed with something that might have been hope. And father added, "They've been looking for you." I called the number on the investigator's report that same evening, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice warm and slightly uncertain. "Hello." "Is this Margaret Foster?" I asked, my voice barely steady. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Allison Torres. I believe you tried to adopt me 27 years ago." The sound she made was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "Oh my God! Oh my God, Allison! James! Come here! It's her!" We met 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. I arrived early, nerves making it impossible to sit still, and watched through the window as an older couple approached. Margaret was in her late 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that filled with tears the moment she saw me through the glass. James walked beside her, tall and steady, one hand protectively at her back. When they came through the door, Margaret stopped, one hand pressed to her mouth, just staring at me. "You look just like I imagined," she whispered. "All grown up." And then she was hugging me, and I was crying, and James was there too, with his arms around both of us, and we stood in that coffee shop entrance, sobbing like we'd been reunited after a war. We sat for 3 hours. They showed me a photo album they'd brought pictures of 3-year-old me during those trial visits. Me laughing in their backyard. Me helping Margaret bake cookies, my tiny hands covered in flour. Me asleep on James's lap while he read to me. They'd kept everything, the photographs, a stuffed rabbit I'd apparently loved, a drawing I'd made of their house with 3 stick figures labeled me, Mommy Marge, and Daddy James. "We were supposed to finalize the adoption on a Tuesday," Margaret said, running her fingers over one of the photos. "We had your room ready. Yellow walls because you said yellow was happy. We'd bought books and toys and clothes. We'd told all our friends and family. And then on Sunday, the agency called and said your mother had changed her mind. We tried to fight it." James added, his voice rough with old grief. "But she was your biological mother. She had rights. The agency said she'd made a mistake, that she loved you and wanted you back. What could we say to that?" "Did you know?" I asked quietly. "Did you know she didn't want me, that she was only taking me back because she couldn't stand to lose control?" "We suspected," Margaret said. "The caseworker had concerns, but we couldn't prove anything, and the system prioritizes biological parents unless there's clear evidence of abuse. Emotional manipulation wasn't enough." James pulled out another folder, this one thick with documents. "We never stopped looking for you. We hired investigators 3 times over the years. The first when you would have started school, hoping to find you through school records. The second when you turned 18, thinking you might be looking for us. The third time was last year when we were getting older and scared we'd run out of time to find you." "Every birthday," Margaret said softly. "Every Christmas, every milestone you were probably reaching, we thought about you. Wondered if you were happy, if you were safe, if you remembered us at all." "I don't," I admitted, and felt guilty about it. "I'm sorry. I don't remember those visits." "You were 3, she said gently, reaching across the table to take my hand. "Of course you don't remember, but we do. We remember every moment." They asked about my life with the kind of genuine interest I'd never experienced from my biological family. They wanted to know about my education, my business, my achievements. When I told them about the building I was managing, Margaret's face lit up with pride. When I mentioned my investment portfolio, James asked intelligent questions about my strategy, actually listening to my answers. There was no jealousy, no calculation about what they could get from me, no comparison to someone else who'd done better. Just pure, uncomplicated interest in who I'd become. "We're so proud of you," Margaret said, and the words hit me like a physical blow because I realized I'd never heard them before. Not genuinely, not without conditions or caveats or comparisons. I broke down, then really broke down, crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since I was a child. Margaret moved to sit beside me, her arms around me, and James stood protectively nearby, and they just let me cry without trying to fix it or make it stop or tell me I was being dramatic. "I'm sorry," I finally managed. "I'm sorry, I've never had this. People who were actually happy about my success, who didn't resent it or try to take it or use it against me." "That's what family should be," James said quietly. "Not what you had, what you deserved and never got." When I told them about the legal battle I was facing about the stolen inheritance and the decades of fraud, they didn't hesitate. James revealed he was a retired attorney who'd specialized in estate law during his career. "I'd be honored to help," he said, "if you'll have me." Margaret made a call right there in the coffee shop to a colleague of hers, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd made a name for herself handling complex inheritance fraud cases. "She owes me a favor," Margaret said. "A big one, and she's brilliant. If anyone can help you get what's rightfully yours, it's her." But more than the practical help, they offered something I hadn't realized. I was desperate for a place to belong. "You're not alone anymore," Margaret said, squeezing my hand. "Whatever happens with this legal battle, whatever your biological family does, you have us now. You've always had us, you just didn't know it." James nodded. "We waited 27 years to be your family. We're not going anywhere." I looked at these two people who'd loved me as a 3-year-old and never stopped, who'd searched for me for nearly 3 decades, who were offering me unconditional support without expecting anything in return, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of what family could mean. Now I had allies, and I had a mission. Patricia Chen met with me the following week in her downtown office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She was in her mid-50s, sharply dressed, with an intensity in her eyes that suggested she didn't take on cases she didn't believe she could win. Margaret had warned me that Patricia was selective, that she turned down more clients than she accepted, and that her reputation for dismantling complex fraud schemes was legendary in legal circles. She spent 4 hours reviewing everything I had: the photocopy of the will, my grandfather's video testimony, Rose's financial documentation, the investigator's findings, Catherine Walsh's forensic analysis. She asked pointed questions, probed for weaknesses, played devil's advocate, with a ruthlessness that was initially unnerving, until I realized she was preparing me for what opposing counsel would do. Finally, she sat back in her chair and smiled. "This is one of the strongest inheritance fraud cases I've seen in 20 years of practice. The video testimony alone is extraordinary, but combined with the financial forensics and witness statements, you have something close to airtight. Any competent judge will see through their defenses." "Close to airtight isn't airtight," I said. "No," she agreed. "The weakness is that we don't have the original will with the notarized seal. A good defense attorney will hammer on that, argue the photocopy could be fabricated, claim your grandfather was mentally compromised when he made the video. But even without the original, I'd give us an 85% chance of prevailing. With the original, it's closer to 98%. "Marcus Hendricks has the original," I said, "in his personal safe." Patricia's expression hardened. "Then we make getting that original part of our legal strategy. We file for discovery subpoena. His records apply pressure until he's forced to produce it or commit perjury, trying to claim it doesn't exist." We filed the civil lawsuit on March 15th. The complaint was comprehensive, alleging inheritance fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent transfer of assets, and unjust enrichment. We named my mother Emily and Marcus Hendricks as defendants. The relief sought included full restoration of the estate assets with interest, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. Patricia scheduled the preliminary hearing for late April and pushed for an October trial date, explaining that the 6-month gap would give us time to conduct discovery while also preventing the defendants from dragging the case out indefinitely through delay tactics. "They'll want to exhaust you financially and emotionally by stretching this over years," she said. "We're not giving them that opportunity." Anderson provided crucial support throughout the preparation. He'd kept meticulous records from his years of observing my family, including emails and memos documenting conversations with my father about work performance issues that revealed my father's psychological state. More significantly, he'd obtained internal documents from Marcus Hendricks' company showing shell corporations that had been used to transfer estate funds. "How did you get these?" I asked, looking at corporate filings that should have been private. "Marcus and I serve on the same industry council," Anderson explained. "We've had business dealings over the years. I've been quietly documenting anything related to your grandfather's estate since the day he died. I didn't know exactly how it would be useful, but I knew someday you'd need evidence, and I wanted to be ready." He showed me more of his own story during one of our strategy sessions. His mother had taken him to court 3 times, trying to claim she was entitled to a portion of his business income. Each time he'd won, but each time had cost him emotionally and financially. "The thing people don't understand about family litigation," he said, "is that it's not really about the money. It's about control. Your mother will fight this not because she needs the estate funds, but because she can't bear the idea of you winning, of you proving she was wrong about you all along." "I know," I said. "I'm prepared for that." "Are you?" he asked gently. "Because preparing intellectually is different from being ready emotionally. When they start attacking your character in court filings, when they tell lies about you to journalists, when they turn relatives against you and paint you as the villain in this story, it will hurt in ways you can't anticipate. I want you to be ready for that." His honesty was more valuable than any legal strategy. This wasn't just a case to win, it was a war to survive. In late May, something unexpected arrived at my apartment. A plain manila envelope with no return address, postmarked locally. Inside was a USB drive, nothing else. No note, no explanation, just the drive. I plugged it into my laptop with Catherine Walsh present, both of us curious and cautious. The drive contained a single audio file dated 2 months earlier. I pressed play and heard my mother's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Marcus, we need to talk about the Allison situation. She's got that attorney now and they're asking questions about the estate distribution." Then a male voice I didn't recognize but assumed was Marcus Hendricks. "What kind of questions?" "About the original will. About where the estate assets went. They have a photocopy showing her as the heir. How the hell did they get that?" "Rosa," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "I told you your sister was a liability. We should have what killed her. She's family, Marcus. We just need to make sure nobody believes her. The photocopy means nothing without the original, and you still have that right." "Of course I have it. It's in my safe at home. But Patricia, if they subpoena me, if they force me to produce documents, I can't lie under oath. I could go to prison." "You won't go to prison. We'll claim the original was destroyed, lost, that the photocopy is a forgery Rosa created. We stick to the story that my father left everything to me, that he was getting senile toward the end, that Allison is making up stories because she's bitter about being the family disappointment." The recording continued for another 15 minutes, my mother and Marcus discussing strategy for fighting my lawsuit, including plans to discredit Rosa to claim my grandfather had been incompetent to paint me as a manipulative daughter trying to steal from her own family. It was damning. It was perfect evidence. And someone had sent it to me anonymously. I looked at Catherine. "Who would send this?" "Someone with access to one of their phones or offices," she said. "Someone who recorded them without their knowledge. Someone who wants them to face consequences." I thought about my family. My father seemed the most likely candidate, but he would have sent it directly, not anonymously. Emily was fiercely loyal to our mother. Marcus would never incriminate himself. Unless Emily wasn't as loyal as I thought, unless watching this legal case unfold was making someone question their choices. I saved the recording, backed it up in multiple locations, and sent a copy to Patricia. This was the smoking gun we needed, the kind of evidence that could destroy their entire defense and possibly lead to criminal charges. The timeline was set 7 months until we faced them in court. The lawsuit was filed on March 15th at 9 in the morning, and by noon, my mother's world had begun to collapse. Patricia had included in the filing a request for a temporary restraining order, arguing that there was substantial risk of asset dissipation given the defendant's history of fraudulent transfers and the likelihood they would attempt to hide or move funds once they knew litigation was imminent. She'd attached the anonymous recording, Rosa's financial documentation, and Catherine Walsh's forensic analysis showing patterns of systematic fund transfers over 25 years. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted the TRO by 2 that afternoon. By 4, my mother's and Emily's bank accounts were frozen. Every account we'd been able to identify through discovery, every trust fund, every investment account linked to the estate assets locked down pending the outcome of the case. They couldn't access the money they'd stolen, couldn't transfer it, couldn't hide it. The funds they'd been living on for decades were suddenly untouchable. My mother called 17 times in the first hour after the accounts froze. I let every call go to voicemail, listening later to the messages that ranged from disbelief to fury to something approaching panic. How dare you do this to your own mother? You're going to destroy this family. Call me back immediately, Allison. Immediately. Emily's messages were different, more calculated. Allison, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We should talk about this like adults. Surely we can work something out without lawyers and courts. Families shouldn't fight like this. I deleted every message and blocked both numbers. Patricia had been explicit: no contact with the defendants outside of legal proceedings. Anything I said could be used against me, twisted, and presented as evidence of ulterior motives or malicious intent. Communication would flow through attorneys only. The real earthquake came 3 days later when the court filings became public record. Court documents in civil cases are accessible to anyone who knows where to look, and apparently someone at Marcus Hendricks's company had been monitoring for exactly this kind of situation. By Friday morning, news of the lawsuit had reached Hendricks Development Corporation's board of directors. According to the industry newsletter that broke the story, the board held an emergency meeting that lasted 6 hours. The facts were stark. Their CEO was named as a defendant in a major inheritance fraud case. The allegations included conspiracy to conceal a will facilitation of fraudulent asset transfers and use of corporate resources to establish shell companies for money laundering. The evidence as outlined in public court filings included recorded conversations where Marcus discussed destroying evidence and committing perjury. The board voted to place Marcus on immediate administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The official statement cited serious allegations requiring thorough review and emphasized the company's commitment to ethical business practices. Between the lines, the message was clear: they were distancing themselves from him as fast as legally possible. The district attorney's office moved even faster. Patricia had sent them a courtesy copy of our filing, along with a memo suggesting the case warranted criminal investigation. White-collar crime prosecutors apparently took one look at the recorded conversation and the financial forensics and saw an easy win. By the end of March, I learned through Patricia that a formal criminal investigation had been opened into possible fraud, forgery, and conspiracy charges against all 3 defendants. They're facing potential prison time now, Patricia explained during one of our weekly strategy sessions. The civil case is about getting your money back. The criminal case is about punishment for the crimes they committed. They're distinct proceedings, but they reinforce each other. Every piece of evidence we present in civil court can be used by prosecutors in the criminal case. The messages from my mother intensified as the reality of her situation became clear. Voicemails left on Patricia's office line since I'd blocked her personal access to me. Tell my daughter she's making a terrible mistake. Tell her that family doesn't do this to each other. Tell her I'll never forgive her for this betrayal. Then came the emails sent to my work address, which I couldn't block without missing legitimate business correspondence. Long, rambling messages that swung wildly between manipulation tactics. One email would be tearful and apologetic. I'm sorry for everything. I was a bad mother. Please, we can fix this. Just drop the lawsuit and we'll work everything out as a family. The next would be venomous. You're destroying your own family out of greed. Everyone will know what kind of person you really are. Selfish, vindictive, cruel. Emily tried a different approach, reaching out through mutual acquaintances and distant relatives, asking them to intervene to tell me I was being unreasonable, to convince me that lawsuits and frozen accounts weren't how family resolved disputes. Several relatives actually called me their voices uncomfortable as they delivered messages that were clearly scripted by my mother. Don't you think you're being a bit harsh? I'm sure your mother didn't mean any harm. Can't you just talk this out? I referred them all to Patricia's office and stopped taking calls from anyone whose number I didn't immediately recognize. My father sent only one message, a brief email that simply said, "I'm sorry, I deserve everything that's coming. But please know that I never stopped caring about you, even when I was too weak to show it." I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. By late July, 5 months into the legal proceedings, the preliminary hearings had gone strongly in our favor. The judge had denied every motion to dismiss that the defendant's attorneys had filed. The TRO remained in place. Marcus's company had completed their internal investigation and terminated his employment, citing violations of corporate ethics policies. The news coverage had been consistent and damaging, portraying my mother and Marcus as wealthy fraudsters who'd stolen from a vulnerable granddaughter. The defendants were cornered, desperate, and running out of options. Their legal fees were mounting. Their reputations were destroyed. The trial date in October loomed like an executioner's appointment. But 2 months before trial, the investigative journalist called. Her name was Diana Reeves, and she introduced herself as an investigative journalist with a national news magazine that specialized in long-form features about financial crimes and family dynamics. She'd been following my case through public court filings and wanted to know if I'd be willing to participate in a larger story she was developing about inheritance fraud and elder financial abuse. I'm particularly interested in cases where family members systematically defraud their own children, she explained over the phone. It's more common than people realize, but victims rarely come forward because of shame and family pressure. Your case is unusual because you have the resources and evidence to fight back. I think your story could help others recognize similar patterns in their own families. I was hesitant. The last thing I needed was more public attention while the legal case was still pending. But Patricia, when I consulted her, surprised me by supporting the idea. Public pressure can be a powerful tool, she said. If the story is well-researched and factual, it adds another layer of accountability. It makes it harder for them to paint you as the villain when the public understands the full scope of what they did. I agreed to participate with the condition that Diana would have full access to public court documents, but wouldn't sensationalize or distort the facts. She agreed immediately and went to work. Over the next month, Diana interviewed me for hours, recording our conversations in my office at the building. She was thorough and empathetic, asking difficult questions, but always with respect for the emotional weight of what I was sharing. She interviewed Anderson, who spoke eloquently about recognizing patterns of family abuse and the importance of protecting vulnerable children from toxic parents. She interviewed the Fosters, who shared their heartbreak at losing me and their joy at reconnecting 27 years later. She obtained copies of all public court filings, reviewed the evidence that had been submitted, and consulted with experts in inheritance fraud and family law. She interviewed Catherine Walsh about financial forensics and spoke with psychologists who specialized in narcissistic family systems and scapegoat dynamics. The feature aired on a Sunday night in mid-August, timed to run 2 months before the October trial. It was titled, "The Inheritance Thieves When Parents Steal from Their Own Children," and my case was the centerpiece, though Diana had found 2 other similar cases to demonstrate the pattern. I watched it at home with the Fosters on either side of me, my hands clenched in my lap as my grandfather's video testimony played on national television, as Anderson explained how he'd watched my family for 30 years as Margaret Foster cried, recounting how my mother had reclaimed me just days before the adoption finalized. The documentary was devastating in its clarity. Diana had laid out the timeline, the evidence, the systematic nature of the fraud with precision that made the truth undeniable. She'd obtained the recording I'd received anonymously, and after consulting with legal experts who confirmed it was admissible evidence already submitted in court, included portions of it in the broadcast. My mother's voice discussing how to hide the will and discredit me played for millions of viewers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, the story had gone viral on social media. Clips from the documentary were being shared across every platform, accompanied by outraged commentary. People were tagging the story with hashtags about family abuse, inheritance theft, and narcissistic parents. Local news picked it up, running their own segments about the shocking inheritance fraud case in our community. The social media response was particularly intense. Thousands of people shared their own stories of being scapegoated by family members, of having achievements stolen or minimized, of parents who viewed their children as resources rather than people. My story had opened a floodgate of similar experiences, creating a kind of collective recognition that this pattern was far more common than anyone had acknowledged. The impact on my mother's social standing was swift and brutal. She'd built her identity on being seen as a pillar of the community, a devoted mother, a respectable woman of means. That image shattered overnight. The social clubs she'd belonged to for decades quietly removed her from membership rosters. Friends stopped returning her calls. Neighbors who'd known her for years crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Emily faced similar consequences. Her professional network began distancing themselves. Friends she'd had since college blocked her on social media. The carefully curated image of the successful daughter with the perfect life crumbled as people realized that success had been built on stolen money and lies. Marcus Hendricks, already suspended from his company, now faced calls for his complete resignation. Shareholders filed complaints. Business partners terminated relationships. The board of directors, initially hoping to quietly manage the situation, now faced overwhelming public pressure to cut ties completely. Industry publications ran articles questioning how someone involved in such clear-cut fraud had risen to CEO in the first place. But perhaps most significant was the impact on the upcoming trial. The judge assigned to the case was known for being fair, but also acutely aware of public perception. This was now a high-profile case that would be scrutinized by media and legal experts. There would be no quiet settlement, no backroom deal to sweep things under the rug. The spotlight was too bright, the stakes too high, the public too invested in seeing justice served. Patricia called me the day after the documentary aired. The judge's clerk reached out to confirm the October trial date is still on schedule. Translation: they know this is being watched, and they're going to make sure everything is done by the book. This is good for us, Allison. Very good. The pressure on my mother, Emily and Marcus, intensified daily as the trial date approached. They were trapped, unable to access frozen funds, unable to rebuild their reputations, unable to escape the consequences of what they'd done. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict, and that verdict was unanimous and damning. And then in September, they tried to run. Catherine Walsh called me at 6 in the morning on September 10th, her voice tight with urgency. Your mother just tried to move money. A shell company account in the Cayman Islands we didn't know existed. She attempted to wire $200,000 20 minutes ago. I was instantly awake. How do you know about it? Because I've had monitoring software on every financial account connected to her Social Security number since we filed the TRO, Catherine said. The transaction triggered an alert. I've already contacted the authorities and the bank. The transfer has been blocked, but this is serious, Allison. This is evidence of attempted asset concealment while under court order. She just handed us proof of consciousness of guilt. Patricia filed an emergency motion that same day, attaching evidence of the attempted transfer and requesting additional sanctions. The judge responded within hours, issuing a warrant for my mother's arrest for violating the restraining order and attempting to dissipate assets. But when the police arrived at her house, she was gone. They found her and Emily at the airport 12 hours later, standing in the security line for a flight to Toronto. According to the airport security footage that Patricia later obtained, my mother was calm, almost serene, clearly believing she was moments away from escaping. Emily stood beside her, pale and tense, clutching a carry-on bag. Then, just as they were about to hand their boarding passes to the TSA agent, Emily stopped. She turned to our mother and said something the cameras couldn't capture. My mother's face went from confident to confused to alarmed in the space of seconds, and then Emily shouted loud enough that everyone in the security area turned to stare. "I'm done protecting you." Airport security moved in, immediately alerted by the commotion. Within minutes, both women were in custody, my mother protesting loudly about her rights, Emily strangely calm as she was led away. The full story emerged over the next 48 hours through Emily's attorney. She'd discovered, while searching through my mother's home office for documents related to the trial, a private will my mother had drafted 6 months earlier. In it, my mother left everything, not to Emily, her daughter, but to Marcus Hendricks. There was a personal letter attached explaining that Marcus was Emily's real father and the love of her life, and that she trusted him to care for their daughter after she was gone. But the will itself left Emily nothing. Emily, confronting this evidence that even her mother's love had been conditional and self-serving, had made a decision. She'd been the one to send me that USB drive. She'd recorded that conversation between my mother and Marcus herself, using her phone during a meeting she'd been asked to attend. She'd kept the recording for weeks, uncertain what to do with it, until she found that will and realized her mother had never truly loved her either. She'd only ever been a pawn. Her attorney negotiated quickly. Emily would testify against my mother and Marcus in exchange for a plea agreement. The prosecution would recommend probation instead of prison time provided she gave complete and truthful testimony and returned any assets she could document receiving from the fraudulent estate transfers. "She's not doing this for you," Patricia warned me when she explained the deal. "She's doing it because she feels betrayed, because she finally understands what you've always known, that your mother is incapable of loving anyone but herself." "I know," I said, "but her motivation doesn't matter. What matters is that she's willing to tell the truth." The court date was set for October, and I was ready. The trial began on October 7th in a courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and family members I barely recognized. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Helena Morrison, known for her no-nonsense approach and intolerance for theatrics. She took one look at the crowded gallery and warned everyone that any disruptions would result in immediate removal. My mother sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, her posture rigid, her face carefully composed into an expression of wounded dignity. Marcus Hendricks sat with his own legal team looking diminished, without his corporate authority, his expensive attorneys working to distance him from my mother at every opportunity. Emily sat separately, her status as cooperating witness, making her simultaneously defendant and prosecution asset. The first 2 days were procedural, establishing timelines and introducing evidence. But on day 3, Emily took the stand and everything imploded. Patricia had prepared me for this, explaining that Emily's testimony would be brutal to watch because she'd be trying to save herself by destroying our mother. But nothing quite prepared me for the viciousness of it. "My mother orchestrated everything," Emily said, her voice steady and cold. "She destroyed the will, forged the documents, and transferred the assets. She told me it was family money, that grandfather had wanted us to share it equally, that Allison was being greedy by claiming otherwise. I believed her because I was young and she was my mother, but it was all lies." My mother's attorney objected repeatedly, but Emily had documentation to back every claim. Text messages where my mother discussed hiding assets, emails detailing transfer strategies, even a handwritten note outlining the timeline of fraud. Then came my mother's turn to testify. She took the stand and immediately began spinning an alternative reality where Emily had pressured her, where Marcus had manipulated her, where she'd been a victim of their combined influence. "I was trying to protect my family," she said, tears streaming down her face in a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Emily convinced me Allison didn't deserve the inheritance because she'd abandoned us. I was weak and I listened to her." The blame shifting was breathtaking. Mother against daughter, daughter against mother, both throwing each other under the bus, while Marcus's attorneys tried desperately to portray him as an innocent business colleague who'd been deceived by both women. When I took the stand, the courtroom went quiet. Patricia had coached me to stay calm, to state facts without emotional embellishment, to let the truth speak for itself. So I did. I recounted 30 years of systematic emotional abuse in clear, measured sentences. The public humiliations, the stolen opportunities, the constant message that I was worthless and unwanted. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the truth, and the truth was devastating enough. I saw several jurors wipe their eyes. The court reporter paused to compose herself. Even Judge Morrison's expression softened as I described being 3 years old and almost adopted by people who loved me, only to be reclaimed by a mother who resented my existence. Then came the moment that shattered what remained of my family's pretense. Patricia asked Emily directly, "Why did your mother favor you so completely over Allison?" Emily took a breath. "Because Marcus Hendricks is my biological father." The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder as she demanded order. Journalists in the gallery frantically typed on their phones. My mother's face went white. Patricia submitted DNA evidence confirming Marcus as Emily's father, along with my mother's private will, leaving everything to him. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place the decades of cruelty toward me made sense when understood through the lens of a woman protecting her affair and favoring the child born of her forbidden relationship. The testimony continued for 2 more days, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendants had destroyed each other's credibility, and the truth was finally completely exposed. And then the judge began to read the verdict. Judge Morrison's voice was steady and clear as she read from her written decision. After careful review of all evidence presented, including witness testimony, financial records, video documentation, and expert analysis, this court finds that the will probated in 1992 was fraudulent. The authentic last will and testament of Richard Michael Torres, dated 7 months prior to his death, is hereby recognized as valid and enforceable. I felt Patricia's hand squeeze mine under the table as the judge continued. All assets derived from the Torres estate, including real property investment accounts, transferred funds, and accrued interest, are to be returned to Alison Marie Torres, the rightful heir, within 30 days. The court awards Ms. Torres full ownership of her grandfather's estate, plus compensatory damages in the amount of $400,000 for fraud and an additional $200,000 for emotional distress and legal fees. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal. Marcus Hendricks sat frozen, his face ashen. Furthermore, Judge Morrison said, her tone hardening, the evidence of deliberate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy is sufficiently egregious to warrant criminal referral. This court recommends the district attorney pursue prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. The criminal trial followed 6 weeks later. Marcus Hendricks received 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud and falsification of legal documents. My mother was sentenced to 3 years for fraud and forgery. Emily, having cooperated fully and provided crucial testimony, received 18 months of supervised probation. All 3 were ordered to pay restitution, though Marcus bore the largest share given his financial means and central role in orchestrating the fraud. I watched the sentencing from the gallery, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, just a bone-deep exhaustion and a quiet sense that something fundamental had been set right. My father wasn't charged initially, but 2 days after my mother's sentencing, he walked into the prosecutor's office and made a voluntary confession. He detailed his role as a witness to the original will, his silence over 3 decades, his complicity in the fraud. His attorney presented evidence of documented emotional abuse and coercion letters from his therapist, describing patterns of psychological manipulation, and testimony from Rosa about my mother's threats. The prosecutor, perhaps moved by the voluntary nature of his confession or the clear evidence of domestic abuse, offered a deal. My father received a suspended sentence of 1 year plus 200 hours of community service. He'd have a criminal record, but he wouldn't go to prison. I saw him once after his sentencing outside the courthouse on a gray November afternoon. He stood by his car, clearly waiting for me, but not approaching, respecting my space, even now. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said when I walked over. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. Proud of your strength, your courage, your refusal to be broken by what we did to you. You're everything I should have been and wasn't." He handed me a small box. "These were your grandfather's. Letters he wrote to you over the years before he died. Your mother took them. I found them in her safe when I was gathering documents for the prosecutor. They belong to you." I took the box, feeling the weight of it, of all those unread words from a man who'd loved me. "I hope someday you can build a life where none of us matter anymore," my father said quietly. "Where you're surrounded by people who see your worth without having to be convinced of it." Then he got in his car and drove away, and I let him go without calling him back. When I stepped out of the courthouse, someone was waiting for me. Margaret and James Foster stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, flanked by Anderson, all 3 of them watching for me with expressions of anxious hope. When they saw me emerge, Margaret's face broke into a smile so genuine and full of joy that I felt something crack open in my chest. She ran up the steps, despite James calling after her to be careful, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and felt like safety. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." Anderson joined us more sedately, but his handshake was warm, and his eyes held pride I'd never seen from my biological father. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," he said. "Not just for winning, but for having the courage to fight in the first place." We went to dinner that night, the four of us, at a quiet restaurant where we could talk without being overheard. They didn't ask me how I felt or whether I was okay, or any of the invasive questions people ask after trauma. They just sat with me present and solid, letting me exist in their space without needing to perform or explain or justify. "What will you do now?" James asked eventually, as we lingered over coffee. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks, ever since the verdict became clear. The inheritance was substantial, even after legal fees and restitution payments. My grandfather's estate, properly managed and grown over 30 years, amounted to nearly $2 million in assets. Combined with my own investment portfolio and the equity I'd built in Anderson's building project, I had resources I'd never imagined having. "I want to buy my childhood home," I said, and saw surprise flicker across their faces. "Not to live in, to transform it." I explained my vision over the next hour. A nonprofit center for older women experiencing financial abuse or family manipulation, legal resources to help them understand their rights, support groups led by trained therapists who understood family trauma, financial literacy classes, a safe community space where women could connect without judgment or pressure. "I want to call it the Taurus Women's Center," I said, "after my grandfather, because he tried to protect me and now I can use what he left me to protect others." Margaret was crying by the time I finished. "That's beautiful, Allison. That's exactly the kind of thing someone who survived what you did would create." The house came up for sale 3 months later. My mother had been forced to liquidate assets to pay restitution, and the family home was among the first to go. I bought it at market value through a shell company, not wanting her to know initially who the buyer was. When the sale closed and my ownership became public record, I received one email from her prison account. "You always were vindictive." I deleted it without responding and started renovations the next week. Transforming the house took 6 months. We tore out walls to create open, welcoming spaces, painted over the dark colors my mother had favored with warm, light tones that made the rooms feel safe instead of oppressive. The dining room where I'd been humiliated at Christmas became a community gathering space with comfortable chairs arranged in circles for support group meetings. My old bedroom became an office for the staff attorney we'd hired to provide free legal consultations. The living room became a resource library with books on financial independence, healing from family trauma, and building healthy boundaries. We opened in June, 18 months after the verdict. The local news covered the opening, interviewing some of the women who'd already found community there. One woman, 73 years old, told the reporter that her son had been stealing her Social Security checks for 15 years, and she'd only realized it was abuse when she attended one of our workshops. With our legal help, she'd filed charges and reclaimed her independence. That was when I knew the center was doing exactly what I'd hoped it would. My professional life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Anderson offered me a full partnership in his development company, not as charity or family obligation, but because I'd proven my strategic abilities through the success of our first project. We expanded to 3 more buildings over 2 years, each one following the community-focused model I'd pioneered: local businesses, affordable spaces, programs serving the neighborhoods, rather than extracting from them. Industry publications started calling me for interviews about sustainable development and community-centered real estate investment. I spoke at conferences, taught workshops, mentored younger investors who wanted to build businesses that did good while doing well. My name became associated with innovation and integrity, the opposite of everything my mother had predicted I'd become. But the most profound change was personal. The Fosters didn't just become friends or mentors, they became my family in the truest sense. Sunday dinners at their house became routine. Holidays were spent in their warm, chaotic kitchen, where laughter was genuine and love was freely given. When Margaret fell and broke her hip, I was the one who stayed with her in the hospital, who coordinated her care, who sat by her bedside, reading aloud from books she loved. "You don't have to do this," she'd said, squeezing my hand weakly from her hospital bed. "We're not your responsibility." "You're not my responsibility," I'd replied, tears in my eyes. "You're my family, there's a difference." They started introducing me as their daughter. Not the daughter we almost adopted, or our friend Allison, just our daughter. And I started calling them Mom and Dad Foster, the names feeling more natural every time I used them. I saw Emily once, 2 years after her probation ended. She'd requested a meeting through her therapist, who wanted to facilitate a conversation about accountability and healing. I agreed to meet in a neutral space with the therapist present. Emily looked different, smaller somehow, less confident, her designer clothes replaced with simple, modest outfits. She apologized for her role in the family dysfunction, acknowledging that while she'd been manipulated, she'd also chosen to go along with the cruelty because it benefited her. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, echoing our father's words from years before, "but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what she did to you, what we all did to you, and I'm sorry." I didn't forgive her, not fully, but I didn't tell her to go to hell either. I accepted her apology and told her I hoped she'd found therapy helpful. We didn't become sisters in any meaningful sense, but we reached a kind of detente, an acknowledgement that we'd both been damaged by the same woman in different ways. She sent one letter after that meeting delivered to the Torres Center. In it, she wrote about starting over, building a life based on actual work, rather than stolen money, trying to become someone she could respect. I didn't respond, but I kept the letter in a drawer in my office, a reminder that people were complicated, and healing wasn't linear, and sometimes the best you could do was acknowledge harm, without knowing if redemption was possible. My mother sent letters from prison too at first. Angry screeds blaming me for destroying the family. Manipulative pleas claiming she'd been mentally ill and deserved compassion. Attempts to rewrite history where she'd been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. I read the first few, then started returning them unopened. Eventually they stopped coming. 3 years after the verdict, I sat in my grandfather's old office at the building where I'd first discovered his letter to me. The room had become my favorite workspace, surrounded by his hand-drawn plans and the photograph of him as a young man full of dreams he'd somehow managed to channel toward protecting a granddaughter he'd barely known. I thought about the Christmas dinner that had started everything. My father's cruel introduction, Anderson's unexpected defense, the cascade of events that followed. Part of me wished I could go back and tell that humiliated, hurting version of myself what was coming. The pain, yes, but also the victory. The family she'd find, the life she'd build, the freedom she'd claim. But maybe she wouldn't have believed it. Maybe some things you have to live through to understand. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, me standing between Margaret and James at the Torres Center's opening, all three of us smiling like we'd won something more valuable than money or vindication. We'd won each other. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was finally living. And that's where my story ends, or perhaps more accurately, where my real story finally begins. Standing in that office my grandfather preserved for me, surrounded by people who chose to love me rather than being obligated by blood to tolerate me, I realized something profound. Family isn't about who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up when you need them, who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself, and who celebrates your victories without resentment or conditions. My grandfather understood that 30 years before I did. He knew his daughter was incapable of loving me the way I deserved, so he built safeguards into his final act of love protections that would activate exactly when I needed them most. Anderson honored that trust for 3 decades, watching and waiting for the moment I'd be strong enough to claim what was rightfully mine. The Fosters never forgot the little girl they'd almost adopted, searching for 27 years, because some connections transcend the legal definitions of family. And Rosa, despite her fear and decades of silence, finally found the courage to speak truth when it mattered most. The Torres Women's Center now serves over 200 women annually, providing free legal consultations, financial literacy workshops, and support groups for those experiencing family financial abuse. We've helped daughters reclaim stolen inheritances, mothers escape financial control by adult children, and elderly women recognize when family obligation has crossed into exploitation. Every woman who walks through those doors and finds validation, resources, and community is proof that pain can be transformed into purpose. My relationship with my biological family remains fractured and probably always will be. My mother is serving her sentence in federal prison, still maintaining she was the victim in all of this, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Marcus Hendricks lost everything: his career, his freedom, his reputation. Emily finished her probation and moved to another state building, a quiet life away from the wreckage of our family name. My father completed his community service and sends me birthday cards each year with brief messages acknowledging what he failed to do when it mattered. I don't respond, but I don't throw them away either. Some relationships are too damaged to repair, and that's okay. Healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means accepting what was grieving, what should have been, and building something new with people who've proven they deserve your trust. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've spent years being told you're not good enough, if you've been scapegoated or manipulated or made to feel like your worth is conditional on serving other people's needs, I want you to hear this. You deserve better. The family that tears you down doesn't get to define your value. Your worth isn't determined by people who've chosen to be blind to it. And if you're watching this as someone who's been the enabler, the person who stood by while someone else was hurt because intervening felt too risky or too hard, it's never too late to speak truth. Rosa lived with guilt for 30 years before finding her courage, but when she finally acted, it changed everything. Your testimony might be exactly what someone needs to break free. Now I want to hear from you. Have you experienced family dynamics like the ones I described? Have you had to set boundaries with toxic family members or watched someone you love struggle with family manipulation? What would you do if you discovered your family had been hiding something this significant from you? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to realize they're not alone. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future stories about resilience, justice, and the courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone around you demands you sacrifice your well-being for their comfort. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that standing up to family toxicity isn't betrayal, it's survival. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing my journey from that humiliated daughter at a Christmas dinner to the woman I am today, free, strong, and surrounded by people who love me without conditions. And remember, you are not defined by the family you were born into. You are defined by the life you have the courage to build.